Bonjour, merci d'être.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the key interest rates, exceptional. So our topic, choosing between inflation and growth. The topic of this debate may sound a bit delayed, but it's essential in its practical consequences. Inflation is the cost of everyday life, and after shadowing the rest of the campaign, well, growth is employment, activity, boils down to. For the central banks, to talk about the central banks, we'll have Thierry Jacquia talking about their influence. Bertrand Jacquia, that is. As a member of the Cercle des économistes and expert in finance, who play the role as coordinator, he will talk about the context of the debate, or set the context of the debate, even though he will mention that this is not a new debate. We'll have three speakers, keynote speakers. Vanessa Holtz, Director General of the Bank of America Securities Europe. Vanessa Holtz, and she has more than 25 years experience in different banks, and as a financial expert she spent years in England and came back after the Brexit when her bank decided to set up in Paris its new trading office in Paris. Philip Mills, since 2013, Director General of SFIL, the public development band at the service of local authorities, public hospitals, and major exporters. He also knows the financial system by heart. Former head of in charge of placing the French debt on the markets. He is the key representative of French banks. Karamo Kaba is the governor of the Guinean Central Bank since 2021. He studied the economy since his thesis and has worked with Christian de Boissieu from the Cercle des économistes. The economists talk a lot about the extent of the powers of the CCE, the CBE, while the Fed has a lot of levers at its disposal that concerns not only tariffs but also employment, prices. We'll see where the Guinean bank positions itself with all this. So without further delay, we'll start our panel with Thierry or Bertrand. So Bertrand. My name is Bertrand. You call me Bertrand 10 times. And why do you change my first name? And you've known me for 30 years. So can you hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. So I will make a preliminary presentation before our three speakers take the floor. To my left. And I'll try to cover about 5 different points. The first point I'd like to highlight is, we could say Phillips is dead. Hooray for Phillips. Long live Phillips. For those who have studied economy, you all know who Phillips is. He had invented the idea. It was at the origin of the idea when there was a trade-off to do for a central banker within the scope of its monetary policy. There was a choice to make between inflation and unemployment. So if you want to reduce unemployment rate, you had to accept a high inflation rate. If you didn't want much inflation, you had to accept a higher unemployment rate. And so this is why the American Central Bank has 2 objectives. One is the monetary and financial stability, like for the European Central Bank, the ECB. But on top of this, the Federal Reserve aims at having a high economic growth. And when I talk about my last point, and Mr. Mills will cover this in extent, some would like to add or wish to add to the objectives I've just mentioned for the central banks. They want to add environmental objectives. So inflation and growth. Has this couple disappeared and we have one without the other, conversely, it will be fuel for thought. Second fuel for thought is Does the nature of inflation, has it changed? The nature of inflation, has it changed? And so with the globalization and industrial specialization of the countries, it seems that this has strongly contributed to compress underground inflations. And we accuse the Federal Reserve Board, the American Reserve, not to take care of the inflation of goods and services because the world economy took it into account and compressed its inflation. And it only was concerned with the price of financial assets with a trend to favor the stock exchange insofar as there were problems with the public opinion. So the nature of inflation, second point, does deglobalization that will put back on the table, will shed a light on the inflation of goods and services. Will this transform and change the monetary policies of the central banks? The third point is the importance of technology on key interest rates. So the impact. This may seem quite far-fetched or far away, but you probably know by name an American economist called Ken Rogoff, who published a book that was very famous some 10 years ago called "This Time is Different." It was a book that condemned those who thought that the hills that happened to economies in the past could not happen again. And so he was trying to demonstrate that times hadn't changed. But we still have crisis. But Mr. Rogoff has just worked on a data bank on interest rates and inflation rates in Western economy countries, and that dates back to 1361. So we have today more than 600, 700 years of data available on the interest and inflation rates. And what comes out of this, the analysis of this database, is that real long-term interest rates have dropped by 20% per century, or 0.2 points per year. So the trend is to the drop. And this is due to technology. We could give other examples for that. And the fourth point, 1.37%, right? Okay, that was the figure. Is the problem of multi-objectives of central banks. We could add, like Mrs. Lagarde did, the environmental objectives, add this to the monetary policies of central banks. And the last point I would like to address, or just mention at least, is the relationship between the subject of today's session and the topic of all the rencontres économiques, and that's bring together both worlds. So this leads to the fact that we would like to coordinate in a better fashion the monetary policies of the Federal Reserve and the ECB. Is that a good idea? I'll let the people in the panel address this. My friends from the panel to debate over this. Thank you, Bertrand. I'd like to go back on the context of inflation and the causes of inflation we witnessed recently, because there are different causes depending on the country. But what we share in common in terms of causes is that we had COVID, the pandemic, a first inflation wave that had not been predicted. It was planetary, had a very strong impact on the everyday life of consumers and also on the behavior of those same consumers. So we saw a drop in production, a shock of supply chains. We saw the cost of freight multiplied by a fivefold, which was absolutely never been witnessed before. And we saw a rotation of consumption also. i.e. we move towards consumption of production goods, durable goods rather than consumer goods, which is not the case today. What was important in the U.S. is that there was a fiscal stimuli that accelerated demand, that boosted demand. So in the U.S. there was a demand shock, while in Europe there was a shock of the offer. And when there's a demand shock, this means that there are a lot of savings. Everything the U.S. accumulated in 2021, more than $2 trillion in savings, and there's still about 500 billion left of that. And on its side, Europe accumulated savings, so there's a demand, there are liquidities, because they accumulated more than 1 trillion euros in savings. A second wave dispersed the US and Europe. The war in Ukraine with Russia. Here, there was an inflation due to energy shock. We saw the price of oil products rise up to $120 and gas multiplied by 2. And there were there's a big dependency of Europe on towards energy, and that's the reason there were different causes on the inflation that took place in the U.S. as compared to what happened, the inflation in Europe. Inflation in the U.S. went up to 9%. In Europe, we had a peak at 10%. Europe had a double impact, the impact of the shock of energy and the effect of the bottleneck of offer. While in the US, yes, there was a shock of the bottlenecks, but a recovery, a budgetary recovery that relaunched the offer. So what was the reaction of central banks? There was a single reaction in terms of timing. First, we saw the central bank and the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England and the ECB rise their rates, but only as of 2022. The central banks wanted to see if this inflation was transitory, and they waited a little longer than other central banks, especially in emerging countries that had already started raising their rates. And retrospectively, the central banks of emerging countries started to lower their rates before the ECB and the Federal Reserve. So there was a sort of like delayed effect that certainly could have had an impact on the magnitude and resilience of this inflation. And so the role of the central banks, we explained this. What is the lever? Well, it's interest rates. We saw interest rates much higher than in the previous decades. The interest rates, we saw that the Federal Reserve went up to 5.25%. For the euro, it was 4%. And in England, 5.5%. And so these were rates we hadn't seen since the last global financial crisis. And what happened? The global financial crisis. Yeah, we hadn't seen this since. I'm Bank of America, so I need to talk a bit in English. And so the role of these central banks was very important. But what we see is that the market underestimated the amplitude of inflation. And just to give you some contextual information, at the beginning of 2024, the central banks and mainly the Federal Reserve, well, the market had pre-positioned a drop of 170 basic points of the rates. That is 7 different quotes. And in the end, we will have 2 or 1 drop of rates, certainly after the elections in December. You talk about divergences of central banks. Of course, the ECB lowered its rates, but it's not increasing. So why did the central banks, why are central banks adjusting their rates differently? It's because the shocks are different. Cost of energy has dropped. The ECB had managed to lower its rates due to that. Did it have the expected effect? Yes, because inflation has dropped. It's still higher than the goal, because it's at 2.5% in Europe. But did it have an impact on growth? We see, in fact, that the countries and globally, well, the growth is quite resilient, because the global growth is at 3.3%, which means that the labor market, investments, consumption is quite important. We see that the consumption in the United States is at more than 10% compared to the pre-pandemic results. And so this impact on the consumption, on services, that And so this is the context of inflation. Savings, of course, is very important. It continues to be very high. Savings are very high. And on growth, it's also important to consider different points. I talked about a growth that is quite important. There's a certain resilience, but it depends on the sectors, on geography, on locations. We saw that on the level of employment, there was employment rate that was quite flexible with a higher rotation or turnover in the US, less in Europe, and on sectors, well, due to the interest rates, with the rise of interest rates, we saw sectors like real estate or commercial real estate, very strong impact there, with a lot more work from home and a lot less of office rentals. That is on the real estate sector for individuals, the impact was practically none. So the U.S. banks did not react well to this rise in interest rates for a simple reason. It's the mortgages, the loans that we do for consumption. When you do, for example, a real estate loan, they're at fixed rates for 85%. When we did loans at lower rates, well, it's of no interest to pull out of these loans. And in the U.S., you can't change your loan. That is, if you pay back a loan to take another house, you can't benefit from the same interest rates, which is not the case in Europe. You have variable rates. It's not the case in France, but in most European countries, it's variable rates, and this is done. So this is the context and the impact on growth. I think we'll talk about the balance later. Philip Mills, thank you. First of all, I'd like to tell you that I'm very pleased to be here, and I see that a lot of people in this round table, so it's an important topic here that we're discussing. So around me I have experts, really top-notch in the sector. Sitting next to me, a person who comes from a great international bank, and my neighbor here is a governor of the central bank, so in Guinea. So what am I doing here? I'll talk as a practitioner of the market of rates, because that's my raw material. I'm the head of specialized banks, which deals with rates a lot, and that are influenced by key interest rates, short or long. And this has an impact on my activity. So Vanessa described in a very holistic way what has been happening since the COVID up to today. I'd like to maybe talk about the medium term. There are two questions, in my opinion, with a view to the first remark Bertrand made on the Phillips curve, and that disappeared and reappeared. So the first question: in what inflation regime will we be in the coming years? Before COVID, there was no inflation. I was looking at the figures. The average inflation in the 10 years before COVID was less than 1%, and the average rate was around 1% in the Eurozone. And in fact, since COVID, if we work on averages, again, based on the zone Euro, we're at 4 to 6% average, with a peak at 10%. And today we're going back to the target of 2 in France. The latest is 2.1 in France and 2.5 in Europe. And so will we go back to 2% or under 2 and get closer to the previous inflation regime? I don't believe that will be the case, because beyond the usual impacts of the demand policy and stimulation of demand through budgetary policies to face these shocks, there are several reasons that I'll explain, and that are more on the offer side than on production side, that lead us to believe that we will not recover the regime we had before COVID. The first reason, you read that in the papers every day, is the deglobalization. So the fact that today a certain number of companies prefer to ensure the security of their supply chain rather than the maximum economic efficiency. The second reason that we have an economy in which there are some large enterprises that have quite an exceptional market capacity. They have a capacity to do better prices. And the second reason is a demographic reason. Most of the great countries of the planet today have an active population, and in the years to come, that will either stagnate or drop. And as Bertrand said at the beginning, the disappearance of inflation, there was the oncoming of hundreds of millions of Chinese workers, for example, laborers. In the future, it's not going to be the same. It's not the same projection. And the other element is when you have a high public and private debt level, it's not really in favor of a low inflation regime. The last element is the decarbonation of the economy. And I will quote someone here who's much knowledgeable than me, Madame Lagarde, the president of the ECB. She did a speech on the 14th of June at the Dubrovnik Economic Conference, and in her speech, she has a very explicit manner. I recommend that you read this speech, that the geopolitical fragmentation and climate transition were negative offer shocks, at least for quite a long period before different effects take place. So it's probable that we'll still have more inflation. But if we turn to growth with this medium-term objective, if we do one of the classical reasoning for a medium-term growth, three factors: capital, labor, and the global productivity of factors. Capital. If we look at what you need to do in terms of climate transition, you will replace capital, but not to increase production and not to do productivity gains, but take into account that there was a factor that wasn't priced before, that is the greenhouse gas emissions, and more labor, work. Well, that's tied with the demographic evolution. If the active population no longer believes, if it drops, there will no longer be a labor factor to activate growth. And for the other one, you have two schools: the techno-optimistics, who say that AI will generate productivity, and those who look at the recent productivity results and say that for the moment we can't see anything on that along those lines. So I will say that there's a non-negligible risk to have yet even more inflation rather than more growth, that what we've observed recently. Thank you, Monsieur Kaba. Your point of view, when Monsieur Mills talk about deglobalization, that's a question you can answer later. But I saw in different of your publications that you were sort of like concerned with the consequence of present conflicts on the energy supply paths and networks. But first of all, your idea on our key subject. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and really thank you very much for this invitation to the Rencontre économique avec Aix-en-Provence. So before answering your question, let me tell you a short story. Often in Paris, I like to wander around Barbès, Rochechouart, and I often run into this gentleman, and he always asks me the same question: do you like Bouteflika? And so the first time I told him, yes, and he went crazy, you know, just, do I like Bouteflika? Do you like Bouteflika? The president of Algeria. And he went crazy over me, you know, he was really upset. A few weeks later, run into the same gentleman, same question: do you like Bouteflika? And I remember the first time I ran into him, so I said, no. And again, he hollers at me and he goes very upset. And a few weeks later, I met the same guy again. I remember the first and second time, and I say, I don't know. And same thing, it goes crazy. Just to tell you that when you're a public decision maker, whatever you do, people will go for you. So you have to accept this. So to answer your question, of course you have to do everything you can so that to ensure growth. And when the central banks started to rise the interest rates 2 years ago, everybody and me, as first, we thought there would be a world recession. But the recession, we didn't see it. We didn't see it because there are some states who implemented budgetary stimuli. And so, to illustrate my position, according to the rules of the central banks, if you take the non-financial credit sector, in 2018, we were at 152% of the GDP. We went to the highest level at 159% in 2023, and recently we brought it down to 157%. And so this drop, well, the states implemented budgetary policies. We saw that in France, we saw that in the US and in Japan. And this budgetary situation enabled to cancel, but not entirely, the impact of the monetary situation. It's also something that explains the difference in growth between the Eurozone and the US. Earlier, Mrs. Vanessa was saying that when you take the consumption of households, for example, compared to the fourth quarter of 2019, in the US we're at plus 10. When you do the same comparison in the Eurozone, we're around minus 16%, which explains why, according to the IMF, this year there will be a positive result of 0.4% in the US, while in the Eurozone will be at 0.05%. So all this explains why the ECB has lowered on the 6th of June its basic rate since the beginning of the pandemic. And so, since I'm the governor of the central bank in Guinea, well, we had to follow the same. So what we noted is that there was a rise in the loan rates. You must know that in our country there was a spread that exploded. We were around 190 basic points before 2019, and after that we went to, after February 2020, we were at 60 basic points, and now we just lowered at 300. So you see that the credit conditions have been hardened. And what we saw also is that demand for credit on behalf of businesses had dropped, while bankers were giving away less and less credit. So that's why at the Guinean Central Bank we decided to accompany the stimulation of the state budget to so we supported, yes. And as Michel Rocard used to say, you can't decide on growth. You can't decide growth, I'm sorry. As I said, that's why the authorities of Guinea focused on structural reforms. We focused on the local content. That is, as of now, we will focus on local production. And so, as far as inflation, it's something that we should not neglect, because if you leave it aside, the people will remind you of the importance of this, either during the elections, with their ballots, like here, for example, or on the streets with riots, like the Yellow Jackets, for example. We had the Arab Spring, and we had riots in Kenya because they raised the VAT rate. And as Karl Ottopal would say, the president of the Bundesbank, inflation is like toothpaste. Once it came out of you take it out of the tube, it's very difficult to put it back in. And he added that is the reason why you shouldn't press on the tube too much, And for us in Guinea, we have experienced an inflation that was imported and quite high, because when developed countries, when there's a recession, and that's what we learned studying economy, the adjustment is done by prices. And when developed countries start subsidizing the demand, while at the same time you have an offer that drops, well, the adjustment is done by prices, and the prices rose accordingly. And so we took this first wave of inflation. The second wave of inflation we suffered from is the consequences of the war between the US and China. And so no later than on the 16th of May, we found out by President Biden that it would increase by 100% the taxes on Chinese electric vehicles. So what happened is that the Chinese preempted all containers. So if you want to have one container to import goods in our country, the costs have exploded. And so skyrocketed. So in the coming months, I think the inflation rate will go up again. We have something also in the US. When you look at the CPI, shelters represent 30%. The shelters are the rents that owners would pay if they were the renters. And so the rise is about 7% per year. If you take 30% times 7%, that is, if real estate prices remain at the present level, we're already at 2.1% of inflation rate that is guaranteed for the months to come in the US. And so, as Mr. Philippe said, I don't see inflation dropping under the targets of the central bank. So we will stay at high levels, even if it's lower than it was in the previous months. So I'll stop here. I think I'm no time. Thank you.
So, all four of you, if you have heard properly, you said that inflation is difficult to get back into the toothpaste tube, and what are the conclusions we draw from this, from the point of view of political action? I'd like to say very quickly, I think we have more or less the same conclusions. To be able to find a situation of balance, the level of the balance won't be the same as pre-COVID. We'll see, we'll have to look at the deficits. When you look at the level of the deficits in the US, which are at more or less 6%, which is huge, 6% of growth. In Europe it's about 4%. And we have interest rates which are quite high. The debt servicing, in other words, the proportion of the debt to be refunded will have to be quite fundamental if we look at the risks and the high interest rates. And I can't see the interest rates going down, or inflation going down to pre-COVID levels. So I think on that point we all agree. The fundamental point will be the budgetary policies, and in all of the economies, all economies need to try to reduce these deficits. You mentioned the debt in relation to GDP. If we look at the debt in different geographical areas, for example in the US, which is above 120%, it was at 65% about 10 years ago. Except that these levels of debt, the cost of refunding the debt with low interest rates is quite low. And if you have these debts which have increased and have more than doubled in the US, and the same thing in Europe, and in France too, where there's a big deficit, we know perfectly well that this means that debt servicing, the capacity to refund these debts, will be very difficult to put in place. So all the central banks have to take account all of these factors. We say that the mandate of the World Bank and the stability of prices and of the Federal Reserve is employment and growth. And I believe indeed that the central banks will have to work with the politicians to go beyond this and to favor growth. And this goes hand in hand with the ecological transition and the digital economy and the technological innovation as well. So, if I continue talking about my view, as looking in the medium term, the last question that Bertrand asked, I was very struck when the ECB redefined its monetary policy 3 or 4 years ago, where it signed that the target for inflation in the medium term was 2%. You may remember, at the same time, it also published a communiqué indicating how it was planning to take account of all of the effects of these policies on climate transition. And in particular, it asked the banks, and we are one of the banks that are supervised the ECB, were asked to analyze their balance sheets and as a function of this risk, and to determine whether it needed to change its securities purchasing policy to favor green bonds more. For me, my question in this respect is quite simple. Vanessa has just said quite rightly that public debt and deficits and the OECD are at a high level. So at one time or another, probably we will have to bring them down. In addition, there are priorities that need to be defined, and other priorities in addition to the climate transition. There are two which I think I find quite obvious for the OECD countries, which is, first of all, education and the way we invest in education and the quality of education and training of our future generations. And then there is defense. Because in this increasingly fragmented world, in geopolitical terms, it's become a more dangerous world than before. I don't need to explain to you why this is the case. So there are other priorities as well, in addition to climate transition relating to deficit and public debt. The support of the climate transition is not the only priority. So concerning the climate transition, excellent reports have defined this. The most recent was from Jean Pisani and Mamafous, which is the first report to be published in French, which really described the macroeconomic path for the next 10 years to ensure we comply with the decarbonization curve. This decarbonization curve, first of all and foremost, results in a negative supply shock with less growth, and also it is characterized by a very high investment wall. First of all, from the public sector point of view and from the private sector point of view. And so those who want to invest in this area must be able to do this in conditions which allow them to do so. And from that point of view, this isn't directly linked to the debate we're having at the moment, but it is indirectly linked. The long real interest rates that they have to manage have to be rates that they can manage, that are acceptable to them. And I think for this to happen, and I think the bankers have not yet decided how to do this, but I think the key interest rates have a key impact on these changes, although, of course, not the only factor that's having an impact on these. So I think it's very important for this to be taken into account when we're talking about the evolution of this trajectory. In Europe, there's another dimension which was described in another recent report by Christian Wayer, which says that the Eurozone is structurally in surplus in terms of savings. We have a lot of money to invest because of this savings surplus. But today, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is more used to buy American bonds instead of funding investment, in particular in the climate transition in all of the European countries. And so we have to take measures in terms of the regulations and in terms of our policies to push this use of savings more towards climate transition instead of spending it on US bonds. And this should be the number one objective of public policy. In our organization, we're certainly, that's our aim. We want to fund sustainable debt. In my turn, I don't think that the interest rates, at least in the US and in the Eurozone, are going to drop in the next few months. Why is that? Because the drop in interest rates we had in June 2016 from the ECB, you have to read the comment given by Madame Lagarde. She said that this would be data dependent. However, when you look at inflation, we went from 11% to 2.6% in May. When you look in detail, you see that the inflation in services accelerated. We see that basic inflation increased up to 3%. That is because wages, the negotiated wages, have risen considerably. 4.1% over 1 year. This is also due to the fact that in the employment market, we are at the lowest level for the last 25 years, and this is the case for France too. So, for the central banks to change the way they approach interest rates over the next few months, we have to have a change in the employment situation, and this is the same in the US. When you look at the Fed, as I was saying earlier, today it has a positive tax gap of 4.8%. There's no interest in changing the interest rates, so the employment market has to show signals of deterioration before the Fed starts to lower interest rates. We're starting to see this already. We're starting to see, in terms of retail sales, the figures haven't been very good. We've seen economic surpluses, which are not very good in the US because real estate the market is slowing down very much. The prices are still high for the moment. We're at 7% on the Cash-Schiller. When you look at the housing stock, you can see that it's continuing to increase. In other words, households have already taken account of a future drop in the real estate prices. So the households are going to be consuming less over the next few years. That's what they're planning for. This has been reflected over the last few months because the GDP has been taken down. It was at 1.8%. And we've gone now down to 1.5%. And when you look at the essential component of this drop, it is because of consumption. And until we have a stronger deterioration in employment and consumption, quite frankly, I don't see a situation where the central banks are going to lower interest rates as quickly as we would like. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As we still have some time left, if you have any questions. Somebody's raising their hand there, I think. What do you think of our economic system integration of cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin into the amount capped at 21 million to cap inflation? So we said the questions had to be easy. I don't think this gentleman has got the message. So in terms of cryptocurrencies, quite honestly, certainly for Guinea, it has no impact at all. For me, cryptocurrencies, I see these as shares, as I don't really see any impact. I don't know whether you have any opinion on this. For me, the impact is virtually zero. Okay, that's your answer. Another question? Could you explain the savings you were telling us about, the financial savings and private savings, households, institutions? Could you explain that a little more? So the savings we're talking about they are financial savings, and essentially in Europe these are the households, it's household savings who hold these savings. And as Vanessa said, talking about the US, but it's the same in Europe as well, the level of the savings rate in Europe is higher, several points higher than it was before the COVID crisis. I think the most recent figures that Eurostat published stood at about 15% savings rate of European households. In Europe, as for Europe, in the Eurozone, these are rich countries, and they're aging countries. They have aging countries with the major public pension systems, and we observe that there are a high level of savings, even at for the older savers. They hold a high level of savings. Then you have other countries in the Eurozone which have a trade surplus, and so in addition to this high level of household savings, which may be in other areas also, it can be companies that have English savings. There are companies with the trade surplus. They can also have a surplus in terms of savings. So there's a stock of savings in the Eurozone, which again, if I'm not mistaken, before the COVID crisis, it was at between 2 or 3 GDP points, and today it's come back up to that level again. So it's very significant. And the difficulty is not a lack of savings, it's how the savings are invested. It's the way that the savings, since in the Eurozone there is no unified capital market, from the point of view of the legal rules to bring together the different national markets, these savings therefore are sent to other developed countries. And this isn't necessarily the best way of investing when there's a huge amount of investment that needs to be put into the relevant economic area. I'd just like to add something. You said, Philippe, that the pre-COVID rate of saving was 13%. I think it's 19% now. So it's got much higher. We need to see these savings converted into consumption, but we need to put in place our products that are the right ones to finance the climate transition, and also, above all, as you said, we need to have financial products for savings, which mean the money stays in Europe, because at the moment most of these savings go out of Europe. So this is why the idea of a capital market union that France and Germany and other countries in Europe are very much focused on, because it's absolutely vital for these savings, which are huge levels of savings. It's very important for these savings to contribute to investment in growth and development in Europe, which at the moment these savings are benefiting non-European countries. So we have a very high level of savings. We need to have a greater level of certainty. The uncertainty has caused this level of savings to rise, and also the COVID crisis as well. Now we need to see these savings being converted, and this is the only way. There is enough money, there are enough savings to finance the transition for the climate and the environment. We need to have the tools, the right financial tools, and the right projects to ensure that these savings are assigned to the right ecological projects. I'd like to react to that. I agree absolutely with Vanessa in this area of the climate transition. At my level, as a general director of the French Public Bank, I have lots of European colleagues who are in similar positions to mine, who have come to the same conclusions about the climate transition. The problem isn't the lack of funding. The savings, as they are managed in Europe and more generally worldwide, there is an increasing interest in investing in this kind of project, this climate transition project. So I believe in the bank that I have the honor of chairing, and in the banks who are colleagues and friends in Europe, the problem isn't the lack of funding, it's a lack of projects. And when you're talking about lack of projects, I'm also thinking of everything to different types of uncertainty, particularly about the level of inflation. So remember this message. The problem isn't the lack of funding, it's the lack of projects. So very quickly, I absolutely agree with what Philippe has just said. I would prefer to talk about a surplus, saving surplus. This is what we have. This has further increased because of the crisis. If you look at the savings of a country, these are savings from private individuals, plus the savings made by the governments and the states. So the savings are the income minus the consumption minus taxes. So the state savings are the taxes minus the government expenditure. So during the COVID crisis, what happened was that the income rose considerably. If you look at the people who work in a McDonald's in New York, they were earning more money from staying at home than going to work. So when we started to open up the economies again, to get people to work, you had to offer them higher salaries. So the salaries have increased considerably, and at the same time, consumption has not followed that trend. So this savings surplus is there, and it has to be consumed and has to be used appropriately. Yes, I'd just like to conclude this roundtable with two thoughts. Two thoughts connected to what I heard this morning in the first two roundtables in Amphitheatre 1. The first one concerns the interest rates and the changes in the inflation rate. There was a second roundtable this morning called "To have peace, you have to prepare for war," with Florence Parly and a general from Saint-Quentin. We realized that, as Mr. Mills has just said, if you want to have at the same time the budget for the climate transition, and in addition to that, he also mentioned, very slightly saying, you can see what I mean, but it's very important in the roundtable this morning. You're talking about the military and industrial effort. It's very important. A huge effort has to be made to be able to monitor the geopolitical situation. This is a considerable effort has to be made in Europe. This isn't going to bring down inflation or the interest rates. The second thought is the one I heard during this roundtable, which is that there is a lot of savings in Europe. These savings are being invested outside Europe, and we are in our first roundtable with Enrico Letal, who previously president of the Italian Central Bank, who has just published a report on the barriers to competitiveness in Europe, and who was saying that the most important and urgent matter to be able to achieve the objectives that Europe has given itself is to have a unified capital market, so that these savings, which are in surplus, remain in Europe. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. No more questions? One more question. We have a last question.
Yes,
Bonjour, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci d'être avec nous dans cette nouvelle table ronde.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new round table. Is the international world governance possible? It's a renewal. Is world governance possible while the major organizations like IMF or the World Bank or the World Trade Organization, they cannot be reconciled? Question of sharing economic power, very difficult. So we'll try to address this question with our keynote speakers. Thierry Derez, thank you for being us. You are the Director General of Covea, a giant in the mutual insurance. Eric Forel, you are the President of EY France. I was the chairman till the beginning of the week, actually. Lars Henrik Roller, thank you for being us. You're an economist, founder, and president of the International Forum, the Dialogue in Berlin, which brings together actors in politics and economy. And Gary Woods, you're a professor of economic governance at the University of Oxford. And Dr. Tiwan Chu, chief researcher in social sciences and also deputy director on the Research Center in International Finance. And my first question will be for Lars Henrik Roller. So there are already some instances of world governance like IMF, G20, and so on and so forth. And are these organizations adapted to the emergencies of our urgencies of today?
Speak in English. I will try to speak slowly. Obviously, the international order is being challenged, and the sort of what we were discussing in the G20 for many, many years, the rules-based international order, which is based on multilateral institutions, free trade, supply chains, that's all gone. And the world is moving in a different direction. And it's interesting to first maybe think about why is that. And I think one reason why that is that the international rules-based order did not deliver for the people in many ways. And this, I think, is true for the West as much as it is true for what is called the global South. There are, globalization brings some inequalities. I need to combine it with a lot of transfers and social programs. And maybe we didn't do a very good job in that. Even though for the developing world, actually, globalization, if you look at countries like China, a lot of people have come out of poverty. So globalization has also helped a lot of those countries in their terms of the economic development. It didn't solve all the problems if you think about climate and the so-called SDG goals, but it certainly had a lot of benefits. But what the rest of the world is not happy with is the representation, and they have a point, and the double standards of the West vis-a-vis the poor South, or the global South, which is actually not that poor. Some of these countries are developing. So I think there has been the problem. The other issue, technology has changed. I think technology, if you look at what economists call the economics of the superstars, that some companies actually, a lot of them are American, are making a lot of the rent, a lot of the money. And that has also led to a much more active industrial policy of countries. So many, many countries, also in Europe, we're having a big discussion right now, have gotten much more, it's also more French, I might say, has a much more industrial policy where the government actually gets into the act. And that, of course, produces more nationalism, if you think about it, and national economic policies. And all of that makes it very difficult, all these developments, technology, economic policies, also fairness, which has put the global rules-based international order, I think, under strain. I think that's my analysis of why that is happening. Now, what can we do, and what is the way forward? And I think that if you mention globalization, if we focus on the governance part here, then you think, of course, WTO, the trade organization, which is in big trouble. Unfortunately, it's in big trouble. You look at the UN, which is, of course, a very special one, but also the IMF and the World Bank. I think they're very much being challenged. And the problem is, the problems we have in the world, we need international cooperation. So you have climate, you have SDGs, as I said. So I see two ways forward. That's sort of my proposal here for the discussion. One way, and we've been discussing it for many, many years, among other things in the G20, is try to reform these multilateral institutions. Save the governance, which is actually produced by the West, Bretton Woods, by us, not with the rest of the world at the table. So try to take them seriously and try to reform the existing organizations. The World Bank is a perfect example of that, with Anji Banga, the new president, trying to reform the World Bank. Some say good luck, because there are two fundamental problems with that. One of them is finance, because whenever you want to have more impact on these issues of climate and SDGs, you need more financing, and in particular more private finance as well. So there's this big discussion, how can we use the public money to attract more private? But the West is going to have to pay more money to the poor. There's discussions about a global tax for the rich. So that issue, given our budgets, and Germany just finished its budget discussions 1 hour ago, so we have a budget now in Germany, but it's very difficult. And France also is not in an easy situation, I think, fiscally. But we need to have more money for the international organizations. Are we willing to do that? Okay. The second issue is governance. If you want to reform, then you need to give others more rights. United States has veto power in, I think, both of these institutions. Looking at the Chinese here, they're asking for more rights. And I haven't seen a politician from a country, even a democratic country, who is giving up power without getting something in return. So the question is, if we want to give more power to the developing countries, what are they doing to get that? In the WTO, for example, I'll come out close, the big issue is China still considered a developing country or not? So I think reforming the existing governance is going to be tough. The alternative, which I think would be worse, is that other institutions are emerging. There's talk by the Africans of creating a special bank for financing. There's the AIIB, which is an infrastructure bank, which is in Shanghai, which we actually tried to prevent from coming, but it's there. And there's the BRICS Plus as a format, which are emerging. So I think we're at a critical point. I'll close in that. We have a transformation of globalization, or maybe a deglobalization. I think it's a transformation of globalization. And the governance which we need for that can either be reform of the existing system, which I would prefer, but it will require some very tough choices by politicians and by people who vote for politicians, or a new governments will be emerging, which will be much more fragmented, and I think will be not as good as what we had so far. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very clear presentation. I'll hand over the floor to Naire Woods. Naire Woods will mention the opposition between nations. Lars-Hendrik Rodes talked about nationalism, which is a risk. Should we talk about nationalism when we talk about economic governance? Does the rise of nationalism throughout the world is a synonym with chaos? Does it rhyme with chaos? Thank you for inviting me. I was going to speak French, but I saw that nobody needed the translation headsets, so maybe I will address this in English.
So then, we have seen a huge rise in economic nationalism across the world. This is not just the prospect of Donald Trump. We've seen in President Macron's speech in the Sorbonne not so long ago, in the speech of Jake Sullivan and of President Biden. We've seen in the words of India's Prime Minister, of China's leaders, a new embrace of tariffs, of protectionism, of barriers, a smashing of the rules of cooperation that all of us grew up with. And I think we must understand why. Why is that so politically powerful today? Because here in the Rencontre, a lot of people are talking about the need for cooperation and the need indeed for reform, and I agree with Lars-Hendrik. But in my view, first we have to ask, what is the challenge that politicians are trying to respond to with tariffs, with protectionism, with economic nationalism? And in this short moment, let me point to the three main challenges they're trying to solve. And the first is political. It's jobs, it's incomes, it's less precarious work, particularly for a younger generation. And tariffs have become a first instrument of choice as a way for a politician to say, I will protect you, I will put tariffs on. But what we know in this room is that tariffs are not very effective economically at creating jobs. They're effective politically until the truth is revealed and the jobs are not created. So the first idea I would put on the table is that we need not break trade rules with tariffs. If we look at history and we look at what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in the 1930s, which is to turn back to workers' rights, to turn back to trade unions, to think about the other ways we can protect workers. And in the United States, it immediately lessened the call for tariffs. But more importantly, it created a conduit for working people to rise up through trade unions and to move into politics. And what's true across most of Europe and in the United Kingdom where I live is that the workers' parties and the labor movements have now been completely hijacked by the intellectual and professional class, and no one is left representing workers. So it's an economic problem of jobs, salaries, precariousness, but it's a political problem of representing the people who are most disaffected and most distrustful. So the first thing I would say is we don't need to smash the trade system to solve that problem, but we need to think hard about the other measures to use to solve it. The second reason for economic nationalism is the geopolitical rivalry, with China and the United States in front, but many other countries queuing up to be rivals. And here, what is the argument that we make to a Trump administration about why they should cooperate? The argument is a simple one. It's that they can only win in a geopolitical rivalry with stable, trusted alliances. Second, those stable, trusted alliances will only cover a small number of countries because the rest do not want to be allies. They want to jump in when it suits their interests and otherwise not. There is a new non-aligned impulse in most of the emerging world. And that's why even the economic nationalists will need the international institutions that Lars Henrik mentioned. But they won't just be the ones that Europeans are comfortable with, or that, they must include the AIIB, which sits in Beijing, the New Development Bank in Shanghai, the arrangements which developing and emerging economies are making for themselves. And those building blocks will provide a different kind of cooperation and a new way to push for the reforms that Lars Henrik mentioned. And then finally, my last point, the third thing that economic nationalists, including in Europe, are responding to is the competition to dominate the high-value technology industries and to use industrial policy and to use trade protectionism to get there. But no country in the world, not China, not the United States, can compete on the technological race without other countries supplying necessary critical minerals and metals, providing markets so that you can produce at scale, and that scale helps you accelerate and beat others on speed. And so even for the technological competition, they will need not just alliances, but international institutions so as to cooperate with the rest. And that would be my argument for why economic nationalism doesn't necessarily mean we're all heading to chaos and a third world war. It does mean we're heading to a different kind of global governance.
Merci. Merci Mary Woods. La parole au Dr Yuan.
Floor to Dr. Yuan. So until now, liberalism was relying for a great part on multilateralism. Is this still a fact? Is this still true in 2024?
For your questions. Before I go to the question, I want to reply.
Of course, please.
Yes. Response to the first two speakers. They have mentioned the job, and especially Hendrik has mentioned that the globalization does not deliver to the people. I want to say China is also always criticized by that steal jobs from other countries. But I want to tell you the truth that China's manufacturing sector, our employment is peaked in the year of 12, and then decline by a trend, or we lose the job in average for more than 2 million a year in the manufacturing sector. So if China steals jobs from other countries, so who steals jobs from China? The God or the aliens? Either is not. Actually, I think it's robots, because China is the biggest country to make use of the robots. So with the technology progress, the economic growth very fast, the cake is bigger, but the technology progress does not deliver to the people. So this is what I want to reply to the first point. And let me go to the global multilateralization. Now, China is very difficult to deal with the relationship with the US. Or maybe from the other side, it's the same. I want to tell you a good case to deal with the situation. By the end of 1990s, almost 30 years ago, China, Korea, Japan, we start negotiation for a free trade agreement. But so far, no progress. No, not any progress. But very interesting. China, Japan, and the US, we join in RCEP. I mean the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership, which is initiated by the Asian countries, 10 Asian countries. So very interesting. In this way, China, Korea, and Japan, we got the integration. We got a free trade agreement. But why for the three countries we cannot get an agreement? Because we don't like each other. Sometimes China, Japan intention, but when we are friends, but okay, something happened that makes Korean and Japan some conflict. So always conflict among these three countries. But when Asian countries, they initiate the RCEP idea, China and Japan, we like ASEAN, so it's acceptable for both sides. At the same time, if you give up the opportunity, then the other side will win the game. So we compete to each other, also demand us to join in the RCEP. So it enlightened me that the RCEP, I mean the Asian countries, although they are small countries, but when they 10 united together, they are quite strong. And they can say something to balance between Japan and China's relationship and give an opportunity. And so in this way, I think we can imagine Europe is also a neutral power. Like the Asian country between China and Japan, Europe, I think it could be a neutral power to balance between China and the US. And also China and US should compete to each other to collaborate, to cooperate with EU. So that is the story maybe before the pandemic. I mean the TTC and, not TTC, the TTIP, TTIP between US and Europe. At the same time, on the other hand, CAI between Europe and China. I think only Europe can be the influential and the neutral power to to push forward, to encourage the global economic governance and the multilateralization. Thank you.
On fera réagir Lars-Henrik Röller aux propos du Dr Yuan, parce que je pense qu'il aura des choses à dire. Mais d'abord, Thierry Derez, est-ce qu'il...
First of all, Thierry Derez, is it possible today to talk about world governance in terms of economy by steering clear from the idea of economic sovereignty? I think we tend to believe in that. We believe that this will be possible when the German wall collapsed in Germany, everything that prophesied the end of the story at the time. But the end of the story wasn't it a kind of planetary government, whatever its organization may be? But quite rapidly, our hopes, our illusions were dissipated by reality. But nevertheless, I'm talking in French and not in English, for an obvious reason, is that if we want world governance, it will have to speak French. And nevertheless, there are sectors in which a world government works. I'll try to give you two examples. One that is widespread and is spread out in history. Another one which was very short-lived in history. I'll start with the shortest. It's the speed at which we solved the issue, the problem of the CFCs. You remember those gases to protect the ozone layer? Everybody agreed. And it was the scale, the climate, it was very quick. The second example, which is millenary, or dates back to several centuries, is maritime law. Maritime law was a subject that was developed empirically over the centuries, and that led to today. There is one rule that applies on all the seas of the world. And based on these two notions, maybe there are other examples. I'm thinking of the Warsaw Convention in terms of air transport. And from these two examples, which are opposite when in time, what can we draw from this? Maybe the ingredients that are needed to reach world governance. First, necessity, need. Without necessity will do nothing. Necessity, not urgency. Urgency wasn't characterized when you talk about the sea, the rules of the sea. And to react on there should not be losers. Necessity and no losers. If you have win-lose, very human game, will continue, and we will not achieve this world governance. So we may wonder if, except for a major issue that's before us, if all the others are eligible to world governance. So the big subject, I think you've all understood, is climate. Climate, whatever happens. Like for the ozone layer, it's of concern to all of us. And maybe it is the vector, maybe it is the path to achieve this wanted governance. Eric Fourel's reaction, fragmentation, this rising nationalism, is this the sign that it's the end of the globalization of the economy as we've known it until now? I think it's already been mentioned. Maybe we're at a very important moment. Is it the end of globalization? Obviously not. In the end, we lived the 70 years after the Bretton Woods Agreement. the World Trade Organization. We experience a rise, a development of this globalization. Jean Dorez was saying this morning, maybe it was excessive. In particular, Lars recalled this earlier. It left some people on the side of the road, in particular the social scientist David Goodhart. You know, those who were not capable of reacting to this globalization and were anchored in territories that became poorer and poorer because of globalization. So yes, globalization was not a happy moment for everybody. And today we are witness to a shift, to a questioning of the mere existence of this globalization, in particular due to the deindustrialization it gave rise to in Western countries. Not only, you know, the doubts on sanitary sovereignty, energy sovereignty, the COVID pandemic, war in Ukraine, all major questions. So in the end, leading us to wonder if this globalization has any form of efficiency. And this takes us to the pivotal question of climate warming. We see that in the end, the integration of value chains, a mobile phone, for example, that does 17 trips between different countries before reaching the end consumer. So it's probably a factor encouraging climate warming, packaging, and so on and so forth. So it's probably one of the causes of the environmental crisis we are experiencing today. And another phenomenon that we're just starting to become aware of when it comes to talk about the risks of globalization, that is data, personal data, the exploitation of our personal data through AI, for example. If it's, of course, concentrated in but a few hands of major private operators or public operators, but who are not necessarily in Europe, don't we run the risk tomorrow of having a social control over our behaviors, and that give rise to big issues? So globalization has reached its limits, and so the fragmentation phenomenon we are witnessing is quite logical, in fact. Will it lead to the death or the risk of a world war through this fragmentation? I would say no. I agree with Nguyen. Despite what's happening, despite the WTO, which is not working well, globalization is doing well. The exports represented 25% of GDP in the 70s. It reached more than 60% during the financial crisis in 2008, and it stayed at 60%, a little less, a little more. But globalization is still there, and we see that international trade in 2022 continued to grow, 2.5% in volume, 10% in value due to inflation. So globalization is continuing to operate, and somehow, despite the fragmentation, we could say that it's a safety net for the world. And we heard this morning Jean de Caisse, talk about Montesquieu, soft trade, peacekeeping and everything. It continues to function. Not the same way, not with such a simple governance, and of course with strong rivalries between the states. A Europe that has become aware that it couldn't no longer be just sitting there doing nothing, and that it had to react, in particular with a view to a certain number of social dumping events that it has at its borders, the carbon mechanism, for example, competition. 15 seconds, 4 seconds, over. But I would like to tell our friend Xuan, in my opinion, Europe will not be neutral. Europe will be committed. It will commit itself for its values. It will commit itself for its humanist values, and in its way of taking, of considering the mechanisms. I hope that Europe can the elected representative told us the Brussels effect that we saw in terms of our GPD. Thanks to the extraterritorial mechanism Europe can impose, because it remains the largest consumer, has the largest consumer potential. It can impose new government environmental rules, so and so. Regulations are not a problem for Europe. It's a solution for the new world governance that is at stake here. 20 seconds. The U.S. created the Federal Reserve in 1913, 131 years after their creation. Europe created the ECB 41 years after its creation. Why, in both cases, the issue was to face a crisis, one in the U.S., monetary and financial crisis, and two in Europe, the installation of the euro, the advent of the euro, the necessity, I say, the necessity. So since les rencontres are also yours, I will take questions from the floor.
I'm afraid we can't interpret because the speaker is not using a microphone.
What?
I'm sorry, but we cannot translate because the person is not using a microphone. Okay, so we can have a translation. So, when we look at population growth and the forecast for population growth in the highly developed countries where the prospects for population growth are quite low, whereas in much less developed countries the population growth there is going to be much higher, given that these forecasts in different trends, do these create the necessity that I mentioned earlier? Do we believe that therefore there will be no losers and no winners? Now that I've repeated the question, I'm going to answer it. I think yes, this is one of the elements of necessity. We'll not be able to avoid this or ignore this aspect. The people who come after us will have to take account of this. All of the elements, the art of politics will be to make sure there are no losers and no winners. And that's the most difficult thing. There is a necessity, yes. The fact there are no losers and no winners is more difficult. Does human nature make us feel optimistic about that? At the moment, it's very fashionable to ask lots of questions. And Lars Enrique maybe would like to give an answer. People often dissolve parliaments because they answer to a question instead.
So, no, but I think my point was, if you have globalization, I would agree with you, it's not dead, it's going to continue. You also need global rules. And I think that also applies to the Chinese, call them values or call them rules. And I think it's not a criticism of China. I think we in Europe, if we think we're the most open continent in the world, so we're very free, we're very open, we're some accounts more than the United States. But then if globalization produces winners and losers, which it does, then I think we have the responsibility as politicians to tell the people to compensate the losers, if you want, for the winners. And I don't think we've done enough on that. And then if globalization has too many negative effects, it's not the only reason, then of course the people get frustrated. You don't solve my problem. You solve some elite globalization problem and the companies are making more money in trade. But you need to solve the problem of the people. And then they vote for non-democratic parties. This is also true in my country. So I think we need to take that very seriously. I'm for globalization, but it's not a Chinese problem, actually. I mean, China is part of the game, but it's actually a European problem or a German problem that we actually, show that all of this increases the benefits to normal people. They care about inflation, they care about healthcare, they care about prices, and they care about jobs. So that's point number one. I think point number two, on China, I cannot resist. Still, there is a question whether China actually does play by the rules. We're having right now, and I'm pro-Chinese, I'm too pro-Chinese actually, in Germany. We have this anti-dumping right now against Chinese electric vehicles, which is a big thing. And of course, Chinese technology is very, very good. And they say it's all innovation, and they're very, very good, and they're going to be very successful. But at the same time, they're also subsidizing. And I think we need a level playing field, and this is what right now we're discussing. And I think there are many people in Europe who want to work with China, not against China, but on climate, for example. But we need also some movement on the Chinese side, because I do think it's subsidies and innovation. It's not one or the other. And therefore, I hope that the discussions the Commission is having right now with China on these electric vehicles will not end up in a trade war, because I think that would be bad also for climate, because electric vehicles are good for climate, but we get a cooperative solution rather than blaming each other.
Nairi Woods voulait réagir. Et après, je donne la parole au Dr. Yuan.
Yes, I just wanted to say, I think it's a little dangerous, or no, it's a little tempting for economists to believe that globalization will simply continue. But it's ignoring some very big political forces that are changing the rules. And it's not that you're going to wake up tomorrow and find it was a bad dream. The rules are being changed. Onshoring is now a norm to protect jobs. Greenshoring for the climate. Friendshoring. Every company in the world is asking, now, not where can we get this cheapest, but where will there be secure supply in political terms for the markets into which we want to sell? The sanctions regimes, which are creating an entirely different calculus for developing and emerging economies, and techno-nationalism, those five forces are upturning the paradigm of globalization, which is very uncomfortable for everybody trained in orthodox economics, because it requires a very different approach to how to get growth and how to be competitive in today's economy.
Dr. Yuan.
I want to respond to my friend Hendrik. For China subsidies, I think I should recognize that for the local government, there are subsidies, but for the central government, they have no subsidies. And the central government told as I know, I joined a lot of policy discussions. For the central government, they directly, very clearly told the local government, you should not subsidize to the EV companies. But for the local companies, they have their own logic. Maybe many of you imagine that China is only one people can say something, everybody should do it. Absolutely not this case. As I know, for the local government, they have their own logic because their expenditure, their income revenue, their fiscal revenue always cannot meet the expenditure. So they have to run deficits. But the deficit need finance from the banking system to get loans because their bond issuance are very limited. So they have to get banking credit. And the bank needs some collaterals. And several years ago, the collateral is the real estate, the property sector. But now, because the property goes down, collapsed to some extent, not totally collapsed. So the local government have to find something new for collateral. That is the EV companies. And in order to do so, they have to give some subsidies. So I want to say that the central government is very clear about the situation, and they want to fundamentally make a solution is to rebalance the expenditure and the revenue imbalance between the central and the local government. And that is one of the most important issue in this month for the third plenary for China. I think there could be some kind of solution. And for the central government, I think they are eager to open our market access to the global, because China have one lessons and one experience we need to open. One is about 200 years ago, China national store was closed, was locked by the Qing dynasty. And finally, we find ourselves We are far behind the advanced countries. So we need to open. This is the historical lesson, very bad lesson for China. And another is experience, because China started the reforming and the opening since the beginning, since the end of 1970s. So we benefit. I stop. Thank you.
Non, je voulais faire réagir Éric Fourel
Eric Fourel, who wanted to make a remark on this subject. Yes. The rules are going to change, and they are changing now. Concerning the question of subsidies, there is a debate at the moment about whether China is respecting the rules of the WTO and is giving too much subsidy for R&D into electric vehicles and batteries. This is an open question, in fact. The WTO rules don't prohibit subsidies, in particular in the area of R&D. The research tax credit in France represents 7 billion euros per year. This could be called also a factor that distorts the international trade as well. And the same thing exists in America as well. All of these different states use this kind of subsidy as a tool to encourage innovation. It's not necessarily against the rules of the WTO, whether it's for electric vehicles. It's true that China has increased by 30% its exportation capacity for electric vehicles, but it still only represents 10% of exports of vehicles. In Europe, it represents 45%. So there is still, the competition is still very much open, and there's a rivalry and economic competition. That is something that exists. The devil isn't always the one that is the easiest to point at. Concerning the need to change the rules, I'll end with that, if you don't mind, David. The point that we were talking about earlier that Thierry was making, Thierry was talking about the need to find areas of cooperation that correspond to real necessities, and in particular global warming and climate change. This is a key point, and it's in that area that we will perhaps be able to find a new area of cooperation and for worldwide economic governance that will meet a need for the common good. And it's true that states are capable of doing that when they are faced with a desire that is in the for the common good. Let me give you another example, as Thierry gave us earlier. I'd like the audience to react a little bit, perhaps. With a microphone, please, otherwise we can't translate the question. That way we won't have to repeat the question. Thank you.
We've discussed whether an economic governance is still possible. I wondered what should be the three main objectives of an efficient economic governance now in the current world, from your perspective. And I ask a question in English so that you get it, but French answers in French, of course, welcome.
Merci beaucoup, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Who would like to answer that one? Lars Henrik? Yes, it's a very good question.
Is the most efficient way, but I do think we need to get a political agreement on it. So it's not a question of smart ideas or great think tanks and academics making a great proposal. It's getting an agreement between different interests. And, you know, China is going to play an important role. So is China, willing to give more money? Is one issue at the government level. Because it's really becoming an economic superpower and not a developing country anymore. That's one issue. Are we willing to give more rights to China in terms of decision making? Where the money goes and what China would have to do. And are we prepared to do that? And what was said before, I think, is very important. Do we believe in a world? I think it's, for me, very important. Because I was 10 years in government doing the G20. Do we believe in a world of working together? Sounds a bit stupid, but, climate, do we work together? Or do we believe in a world of more alliances? This is multilateralism, multipolar, where Europe works closer with America, and and then you have India, you have the Saudis, very strong countries also financially? Are we breaking into different blocks? Or are we capable of having multilateral global institutions? So I'm a multilateralist. I want to preserve these global ones. But then the interesting question is, what is Europe's position? Is Europe, your point, is Europe neutral? Or is Europe, the Chinese want us to be neutral. They think the sovereignty idea from Emmanuel Macron is a great idea because they don't want us to be too close to the Americans. It's obvious. But I think we should not do something because the Chinese want us to do something. I think we need to think about, as Europeans, where do we stand? And I think we want more sovereignty. We want more independence, but I'm personally, both of my children live in the United States. I'm really half of an American, even though I'm German. Of course, America is our natural ally. But America is also behaving America first with Donald Trump. So I think we need to preserve a certain independence from the United States and integrate more into Europe. This is the debate we're having right now. So I think Europe should not be aligned too much. I think we should try to work with everybody, also with India and also with China, trying to solve global problems, because climate and many things are global problems. So these are the two big things now. Are we going towards splitting the world? And where's Europe? Or are we going toward trying to preserve a little bit the old world of working together? That I don't know.
Neri Wood, vous optez pour quel scénario, vous?
What is your scenario?
Things that would make, we were asked 3 things that we would make a successful international organization in the future. So there's the tempting and there's the necessary. So tempting is like-minded countries coming together to agree maximal agreements and use international institutions to force it on as many other weaker countries as you can. And that's a little bit the model that we've been in the world. So the necessary is the reverse of those 3 things. So first, institutions which all countries want to belong to, or a very large number. So not the easy like-minded, but much more universal. Second, minimal rather than maximal agreement that is the most important thing to be done. And third, that you use international institutions to facilitate the cooperation, not to coerce it. So by providing information, by providing verification. So I think those are the 3 qualities for institutions of the future.
Le Dr. Yuan veut... Please do.
Yes. I believe in market competition. So I think if we want to make the global governance more efficient, we need competition. So that's why we introduce AIIB, BRICS, new NDB, more banks, more options for the countries to join in. And we can compete to each other to improve the efficiency. Thank you.
Une autre question?
Another questions? Question over there. Yes, I have a question. Here we are talking about the rules for world trade and the crisis in world trade rules. Could we imagine that this crisis in world trade rules might have impacts on trade within regions of the world? And here, of course, I'm thinking of Europe. The economic situation isn't very good politically. There's a rise in nationalism and protectionism. Why not find that in Germany, the Italians or the French might be doing things that they don't like? Let's not forget we have the experience of Brexit, which shows at a particular time we may say, I don't like this, I'm leaving. So everything was saying, how does it apply to us in Europe? Cherry, what do you think? How do we see it in our country? My feeling is that this is a question of determination, political will, and the will of the people, therefore. For many years, Europe was presented as the cause of a whole series of difficulties and failures. Everything that was good, it's not only in France. I've done some research. Not only in France. Everything that was good was thanks to the local politicians, German, Italian, Spanish, French. Everything that was a problem, everything that failed, everything that was a barrier came from Europe. And people started to believe that. People started to hear that and to believed that was the case, and for many of them, it became a very strong belief. I think we have to go the other way, and we have to be much more assertive. And when we talk about the advantages of Europe and what Europe can bring us, I have 30 seconds left. Perhaps also Europe should agree to play a different role than the role it plays at the moment. I'm exaggerating a little bit to simplify. The US invents, China manufactures, and Europe regulates. Maybe we could build our prosperity on regulation. Do you think that's possible? Personally, I don't think so. No. You have an answer to that one, Forel? Well, fortunately, the European framework today is so dense that it cannot be undone. And we can see that today that our British friends regret the Brexit, which has caused regression over the last 4 years in their country and economically, which is quite obvious. Of course, there remains a lot of areas of competition within Europe, especially on the price of energy. We've heard about this during this electoral campaign. This is a debate that is ongoing, where countries can have their own energy prices, which corresponds to their own costs, or should we have a more harmonization within Europe? This is a debate that is ongoing, and will continue about the level of freedom that each country has concerning economic competition and energy prices, and this is a good thing. I'd just like to come back for a moment to the three things that we could perhaps do to have effective worldwide economic governance. First of all, we need to define a new project for worldwide economic governance, and this is in the area of the climate that we will be able to do this. We need to have a graduation of the tariff barriers so that they correspond to an obligation to act on climate change, and then the financial measures need to be put in place. And this is when William Nordhaus in the Climate Club, who won the Nobel Prize for Economy. If we're able to use these tariff barriers to find new resources, this has to be done to use finance decarbonization and for developing countries, because they are the ones that have the biggest problems to maintain economic competitiveness while remaining in an approach of decarbonization. These are the two major challenges for tomorrow's worldwide economic governance, is to meet the problems of climate change between 2050, to make sure you have the sources of funding so that developing countries are able to follow the decarbonization curve. And I'd like a third one, which is nevertheless to allow freedom for peoples to be able to express their opinion, and to make sure that the rules are not only made for the anywheres, so that we're also able to think about the somewheres by giving them guarantees to reduce the precarity that people have to deal with. Thank you very much. I'll hand over now to Neri Woods now, who has given me a little signal to say she's going to be very quick.
Most people in this room probably agree that climate is absolutely urgent to solve, but we have a huge problem, which is that very large parts of the population in this continent and in North America believe that climate is now an elite luxury. They will not join the movement they will not rejoin the movement for climate until their more urgent needs are met. And those goes back to jobs, precariousness, income, housing. So I think we must not believe that climate will provoke global cooperation and solve our problems. Quite the contrary. We have to solve those other problems to bring people back to being able to conceive of being part of a climate solution.
Allez, le dernier mot à Lars-Henrik Roller.
I agree with that. Yes. I still think it's an interesting idea to think about a project, but I think climate is a tough one. And it comes back to a little bit what we're saying. We have the COP this year. So the COP is a little bit like the global governance on climate, Paris Agreement, big thing. And the number one issue for COP is finance, money for the rest of the world. And are we in that, because that's another, it's first of all, people have to be motivated, that is a big issue. Second one, are we willing? Because they think we are double standards. We have been developing, we have been emitting CO2, it's all cumulative. We are responsible, the West, the rich are responsible for climate change. And are we willing to help them and give them money? And that's important. So I think it needs to be successful to move the world forward. Thank you.
Et le tout dernier mot, very short one.
Last word.
Our conclusion is that China and the US political tensions are very high carbon emission, are not green relationship. Because of the tariffs, additional tariffs between these two countries, the carbon emission could be like 450 millions of tons. So that's, we will publish in Chinese firstly and then in English. Thank you.
Merci. Merci. On peut, je pense, applaudir nos...
Thank you very much. I think we can give our participants a round of applause. Thierry Thierry, Eric Fourel, Alessandre Goulet, Nigeri Woods and Ken Su. Thank you very much all of you for being with us, and I wish you excellent rencontre.
Attendez.
Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this controversy session focused on education in France. Can we change the trend, the downward trend in education? Thank you for being with us now. I am Sébastien Georges. I am involved with Les Républicains, and we're going to be talking about the decline of education. This is a fundamental issue. It's something that's not been much on the front pages over recent days, unfortunately, but it is nevertheless a really very important issue. We can see today that France is having increasing difficulty in significant rankings, and that's impacting its role in the economic world. So today, particularly through the PISA rankings, we can see that there's a real challenge for France here. However, this could be changed. There's lots of talent in France. There's some brilliant businesses, and our guests are good examples of this. And so we want to reconcile the world, so we need to connect education and the economic world. So to talk about this, we've got Mr. David Dupont-Noël, who is on the far right with regard to me, but not the far right. He is a managing director with Deloitte, which has he's been working since 1992 with Deloitte. He's been an associate since 2001 and a member of the executive committee. Over these recent years, he's particularly focused on auditing and insurance. On my right, in the middle, is Pascal Morand, who is executive chairman of the Fédération de la Haute Couture et de la Mode. He is professor emeritus at the ESCP Business School, which is one of the big French business schools, and he organizes fashion weeks with the main fashion industry players. So the idea here is for everyone each person to express their perspective on this issue of education. And so we'd like to hear from you, Mr. Dupont-Noël. How do you see this question of the decline of education in your activities today? Can you see a significant decline in terms of education? So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to join in this theme. So I'm going to try and convince you about the importance of the national importance of this issue. You mentioned this already. The rankings are not good for France. We are 6th or 7th world power, but on the PISA rankings, we're 26, 27 in maths and 29 in science. Actually, this is true for the whole of Europe. There's only Switzerland, Germany, and another country that have got good rankings. When you're between 16 and 25, we think there are about 10% of young people who don't know how to read. And it becomes 20% if you add the number of young people who have difficulties reading. This is a study done between 1997 and 2017. Only 1% of today's students would be among the 10%, top 10% of the past. So that's a real issue. At the same time, we can see that we've got a whole number of medal winners. We've got universities and business schools that are well known and of high level, which are envied around the world. We've got researchers in a whole number of areas who are behind innovation. So you can really raise the question of how can we have this? How is it that we have this situation? Do we have a two-speed system with a very elitist approach, where there is an elite with resources that are working at an international level, and then there's a much bigger proportion who are really suffering? Or are the positive results perhaps due to a past political approach, past policies that are no longer really moving forward? And so I think this is a real issue that is not only an educational issue, but it's an issue linked to competitiveness, as you mentioned. And these issues around competitiveness, economic competitiveness, are linked into dependency and sovereignty for us at a national level on the international stage. And there are three other components. We are not managing to put if we have a lower level of teaching, this reduces employability for everyone in schools. And so we want to make sure that we can teach people to learn. This is a service that we also are wanting to sell people. The second point is that social inequalities are increasing and are increasingly clear. We can see this in the social professional categories of people that are reaching the best higher education institutions. It's only really the top 20% that are making it into these big schools, and this is not good for national cohesion. So I think that means we need to have a national response that takes into account public authorities, but also businesses, and that's why I'm here today. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Morand, perhaps you have a dual perspective because you are a professor emeritus, but you also used to be a director of a business school, and you are constantly in contact with businesses. When we talk about education, there's everything that happens before the bac and everything that is after the bac at 18. I agree with everything that's been said, but I could perhaps talk a little bit about what happens after the bac, after 18, and also what happens before, because there's a real issue in French education, in the French education system, because there are 12 million students in primary education and secondary education, and 1 million teachers. So there's a key issue in terms of customization and adapting to the different levels that are available. But I just want to come back to the question of rankings, because of course rankings help us to measure ourselves against others. It's really essential in higher education, all the different scientific disciplines, social sciences as well. There's the Shanghai rankings alongside pizza rankings, and there's a whole number of different range of rankings. This is something that we really should take into account, but we should also be aware of a certain aspect of this. Because when you look at PISA, you can see that it's actually focused on a very restricted number of subjects, scientific knowledge, mathematics. So yes, this is something that's really very important. So it's very clear that people are going to have trouble if they're not well advanced in these areas. But very briefly, if we focus on what happens before BAC, we need to think about our policy, our educational policy. We can't mechanically just focus in on one area. It's really important to think about the different types of learning and what is taught. Just a very simple comment on this. If we compare what happens in France and the French education approach, Italian approach, Danish approach, those are some examples. There are other examples. When we think about this area, we can think about perhaps Jules Ferry, but the doctrine, the approach that we have was put in place in the Condorcet speech in 1892. And everything was focused on every person being able to exercise the social functions that they are called to, and accomplish and fulfill their talents. So there's a whole number of very interesting things here in terms of principles. Let's have a look at the Italian example in a very specific area. So the history of art is not at all taken into account in the PISA rankings, but in Italy, history of art is a key issue and a mandatory subject. And it's not a secondary issue, because if there was no history of art, the industry of fashion and creative industries would be a lot less developed, whereas this is a very important sector in Italy. If we look at the Danish case, once again, I'm not criticizing the PISA rankings, but I'm just trying to assess things. But if we think about the Danish education policy and approach, all of this was put in place by a great philosopher of the 19th century, which had a religious approach which was completely in line with the Enlightenment. If you're under 13 in Denmark, there is no assessment. The goal is to give confidence. I'm not saying it's better. I'm just trying to help us to understand these different approaches, the different educational policies. And what counts in Denmark is poetry, creativity, and it's also the fact that there's a sense of community and singing as well. You sing a lot. So you could say that this is Scandinavian, French. In France, we're not Scandinavians. That's how they do it in Scandinavia. And so you can say there's a lot of debate around PISA rankings in Denmark, because not everyone agrees. People say that it could change this sense of the collective, this sense of learning, this sense of creativity and confidence in yourself. And in this Danish approach, the goal was to understand that we are living people who learn throughout life. So I totally agree with what has been said, but I think we had to have an overall perspective on things. I can see that I'm running already out of time. I'm looking at the time here. I want to say a few things a bit later on about higher education. Yes, perhaps I could respond to what you just said. I think, yes, I can accept that in terms of creativity and these sensorial aspects of learning. The only real deficit that we have today is that just that in terms of capacity of attraction, synthesis, we're seeing a decrease in skills. And when we can see in our world artificial intelligence and even in the media, this capacity that we have to sort through all the information that's coming in, to challenge what we're receiving, if we don't have this capacity for analysis, which we really need, that's going to be a real problem. And today, we are in France, we're really missing it in terms of the technical innovation. Yes, we've got some flagships with a number of areas, but that really hides and obscures the reality, because technology is moving forward in China, America, Israel. Isn't it also the case that those big powers you've just cited go and get the best students in France, and there's a bit of a brain drain? Yes, actually, it's worse than that. The best students go and get additional training elsewhere, and that means they are recruited elsewhere. They go to MIT for science in Boston, and then it's Meta or Google that picks them up locally. And then they will work for those businesses. So there's a real issue here that we need to be competitive in these areas. Yeah, I totally agree with all of that. And if I connect into higher education here, there are nevertheless some really brilliant French minds who are working in France, and there's so many of them. But in terms of this European gap around technology, including artificial intelligence, if we compare with the US and China, that's a very real issue. We haven't got very much time. I just want to say three things, if I can. Three things in terms of higher education, three aspects that are not contradictory. The first issue is about university. What is the key issue in university? I would say that in higher education, this is not the case of the big schools, but in order to learn and optimize the system, particularly in all of these disciplines, there needs to be a number of skills that are put in place. There needs to be teaching schools, there needs to be educational engineering, because leading study programs and designing study programs is not the same thing as being an excellent teacher and being an excellent researcher. Of course, there are people, thankfully for students, there are people that can do both of these things, but it's not very straightforward. And the third aspect is the support for students, coaching of students. So we talked about life and learning independence, but also professional coaching and careers support. All of this is really lacking, I think. So the connection with what you're saying is that in schools where these skills, the big important grande école in France, where these skills are present, we need to develop them in universities in order to support more and more students, because so many students are becoming discouraged. They need support. They need new educational schools. The second point is the question of research. Once again, here there's been this approach where we've missed something, because we need to focus in on research. It's really important that we focus on research. But if we focus in on research, that means that we're thinking in a linear innovation approach, a linear innovation model. That means scientific research is necessary, but interactions between innovation and research, and we're falling back into these French, European, and American and Chinese characteristics. This model has been shown to be interactive. So if we could talk about the connection with businesses, which is often complained about, but this connection is really very important. But for me, there's a myth here. The myth is that we are trying to ask whether we need to meet the needs of businesses. Some people say we need to meet the needs of businesses, and other people say no, we don't need to meet the needs of business, and end up in a focused on a post-capitalist model. But that assumes that businesses can determine their needs. But this myth is supported by the professional branches. I'm responsible for one of these professional branches. So is it through human resources? Yeah, human resources, yes, they need to meet needs. We know that there's needs for qualified personnel in such and such area. But we also know that business leaders need people who are talented, particularly in the areas that you're talking about, who provide solutions and also have soft skills. Soft skills is not something that is really easy to learn, because we've got all of these different mechanical aspects that we need to take into account. And so we need to get past this division. And so I need to stop there because I've done my 3 points. So, David, do you agree with the fact that businesses can't be responsible for their own needs? No, I didn't say that. I think in terms of we need businesses that have permanent innovation, and the talents that they're recruiting need to contribute to the innovations that business leaders and that people working with them are wanting to develop. And that the higher that level is, the higher their contribution is going to be. Yes, I think I really agree with you here, is that this is a national issue once again, and business need to contribute to this. I really do believe that businesses are places for learning. So what does that mean for me? I think it means that in terms of continuing training, a lot of work needs to be done. So we've done these training credits system that we've developed in France, but people have started to use it for their driving license. We need to have things that are give more incentives, and so I think this is something we need to develop. It's something we can develop with big businesses. Not all business can do this, but at a sector level, we can organize contribution for training without talking about a learning tax where we talk about $6 per school depending on the background, but something that's really focused in on objectives. At Deloitte, here's a little ad for us. We created a business university. 5% of our employees' time is devoted to continuing education. That's something that's really important. The second aspect is because you talked about the fact that all of these training courses are about them having the resources they need, and everything is focused on learning. I can hear today people talking about the fact that there's doubt about apprenticeship. This apprenticeship approach and whether the support is going to be continued. This is something that was accelerated during COVID, but no, this is something we want to continue. This needs to contribute to the national cause. We can't put aside apprenticeships and just say it's a problem for the education system. So yes, there are businesses that create their own training centers, but not all businesses have the size to do this. So we have this issue where we need to expand and make sure that it's not just the most qualified people that are benefiting from this. Businesses need technicians, they need a whole number of different skills. How do you see this? How do you manage this aspect? Yes, this is something that we're continually doing. We've decided, together with all the brands, all the big brands and all the groups working in fashion, we decided to develop skills at a national level. This is something that we want to do. I'm not here to promote what we're doing. But we can put a whole range of different things into this, because there's some things that are done in the grandes écoles, the big educational, the big schools here in France. So there's some cross-cutting initiatives that we can put in place, and there are also some sector initiatives that we can put in place. So in the fashion industry, we've got a whole range of different programs going from basic educational certificates. This is something we have to work on at the lowest level, the certificates of professional aptitude, and we need to think about how all of that comes together, and then we connect it all the way through up to doctorates. So these are really key areas that we need to work on and develop cooperation, and we need to cooperate within territories, because there's a risk of isolation with businesses. This is something that's really very important. When we live in more rural areas, it's sometimes a real challenge to get access to training because there are financial blockages, etc. David, you want to make this a national cause? Yes, I talked about the business side and what businesses need to do in terms of the contribution of business, but there is also a responsibility on the state side, of course. There's a collective responsibility here. This is a key economic and cultural issue, and it's linked into sovereignty and independence. So this question of a national education system, this education in the broader sense, the fact that it's kind of sort of 8th or 9th in opinion surveys in terms of what's a priority for people. So we've got employment, we've got inflation, all of that is much important. So education is about 7th or 8th on the list, and that's not promising in terms of reversing this trend. They had this experience in Germany about 20 years ago. They were in a bit of the same situation. And it's a bit different there because they have the different lands, and they managed to federate together in order to put in place an incentive to improve the situation. It's a real issue around cohesion at the national level. If we don't make it possible for all people to have education that gives them confidence for the future, we'll have lost something. At the moment, we are putting a division between the private sector and the public sector. We need to bring them together. There needs to be flexibility with the national education system in order to learn methods from the private sector or export approaches out. There needs to be a greater permeability between these two worlds. We need to try and go further rather than separating things out. We can see there's a lot of private equity funds that are investing in private schools and investments because the parents are involved there and there's a confidence. And that's something we're losing in the public sector, but that we need to put in place. I want to come back to this question of permeability, which is really fundamental. If I had 3 words about this, the first word is perhaps the most important, but they're all important. There's this question of the cross-cutting nature and the diversity. Innovation is born of diversity and of cross-cutting approach. If we have a silo approach, then we'll do some things really well, but we won't have a collectively optimal approach. So we really need lots of innovation, and this innovation is fed by a cross-cutting approach. And then there's the question of confidence. There's confidence in the system, confidence in the players in the system, the teachers, and what they're doing. We know that COVID was a catalyst for a degradation of confidence, and we really need to keep in mind that the youngest members of society, even in the top schools, this is something that really needs to be continually developed. There needs to be educational innovation in order to encourage people to develop confidence through encouragement and through support. If you look today at a lot of young people, there's a real lack of confidence. There's depression. I don't want to be too dramatic here, but there's a real sense of unease. Whatever the know-how, the knowledge that we're communicating, we can't teach knowledge of any kind and cultivate positive and productive emotions if at the same time everything isn't being done in order to develop confidence. The key issue of young people today, I'm not talking about the best students that succeed in everything, but generally there is an issue of confidence, and this issue of confidence is a national problem. We have 15 seconds left. David, do you have anything that you'd like to add at this point? Yeah, I'd really like to underline this national cause that needs to be made a priority in order to avoid increasing this social fracture, in order to strengthen employability and make it possible for all of our young people to find a place in society. That's really fundamental if we don't want to hit a crash. So thank you very much to both of you, and thank you to all of you who have listened to this.
Hello, and welcome to our debate on the media between freedom and accountancy. And we're happy to have one of the key representatives of the French media that can eventually shed a light on one of the major questions on the value of information. It's been hitting us for some months. Our main witness will be Amphi from the Cercle des Économistes, who's worked on a report on information. Still a few months before it's published. Pierre Louette, who's the head of Les Échos and Le Parisien, belongs to Bernard Arnault. We have David Guiraud, director of West France. Arnaud de Puyfontaine, the CEO of Vivendi. And Mira Milosevic, who directs an NGO which works on the freedom of journalism. So, Anna, the floor is yours, Anne Perrault. So we're at the Rencontre économique d'Aix. It's good to go back to the essential elements of our discussions. The traditional debate on the media lies on two fundamental essential pillars, which are the one side, the audience, the paying audience, the subscriptions for television, and advertisement income. So these two sources of income being in a variable proportion. And what is not given under subscription are the platforms. So, of course, there are subsidies from the government in variable proportion. So this traditional model was challenged in the last 10 years due to several phenomena which find their source in the onset of digital platforms and social networks. The first source is that these platforms and networks ended up proposing to those who were seeking to find information a different free of charge format, from the 15 seconds of TikTok to access via Google News, to a few lines of articles taken from newspapers selected by the Google algorithm. But what we can say, nevertheless, is that these new formats and free, slowly but surely, have satisfied the need for information of a lot of readers, of auditors, of readers who've decided not to pay for information. So the first side of the loss, that explains the loss of audience. And from the moment you no longer have an audience, difficult to be profitable for the announcers and advertisers. The media are bi-faced platforms, twin-faced platforms. To function, they need several categories of readers who have access to content. The third type of users are journalists. So the readers are there to have access to content. And once this audience is there, announcers and advertisers are there to propose their ads to the readers or audience. And to this is added a second problem, which is also linked to the digital the evolution, and another phenomenon, that is the income of advertisers that land in the media, even for the online people, are captured mainly by Google and Facebook, who are the two key actors of this market of info ads. Google and Facebook trust the advertisement inventory, so the screens on which the ads will be presented, but they've ended up monopolizing all the chain of advertisement, the services necessary to stand between the announcer who wants to send his ad, and the reader or auditor who will watch this message. So they've monopolized these messages of ad tech. And each time an economic player has a monopoly or captures an important share of the income, each time this happens, well, there's a problem. So what happened? In the end, the media were dispossessed from two sources of income, which were their audience and their advertisement income, and this gave rise or accompanied the onset of new shareholders who tried to cover for the losses of the media. Don't want to give too much figures to dramatize, but you must always bear in mind that in several cases the economic model has been subject to a shock, and some media may not recover from these shock. And we'll see some more optimistic examples with the people who are here on this table, but around this table. But there is a state of emergency for the media. So these new shareholders, obviously, we hear a lot talk about them, even very recently and locally, with acquisitions by Rodolphe Sadé from CMA-CGM very recently, but he's not by himself, not alone. And progressively, we saw Kretinsky, Bolloré, Bernard Arnault, and several others invest in the media. Is this good or bad news? That's the problem. It's the two, both. It's a good news because we need media. We need the media. And the media need income. And so these new shareholders in the media sector are obviously welcomed, and we need them so that they can finance the economic model of media. But in the same time, we see that these new shareholders that we call the billionaires, with a kind of ostracism, because we think that they're not always very clean. And these new shareholders, like all new shareholders who take over a company, they want to direct their enterprise following their own line, except that in the field of media and information, the line is very important, because information is a public good, and we need an objective, non-biased and non-distorted information by personal interests. And so these are the questions that we will address during this roundtable. So this said, there are several other models, different models for the media. If you take the case of Germany, for example, in Germany, some major media groups were formed, like the Bertelsmann Group, for example, which is a profitable group made up at the basis from the media. It's not something we know, with maybe one exception. We'll talk about this later. It's not exactly the French model, and this is linked to, related to Franco-French circumstances and the context, the control of concentration, which is regulated in France and stops the concentration of media groups. But in reality, the question we ask ourselves, and that will be discussed in this roundtable, is that the onset of these new actors put information at risk in terms of non-biased and honest information. So, of course, this boils down to the question of governance, how the choice of the new director can have an impact. What are the forms of this nomination? Who needs to be consulted? There will be some charters, ethical charters that plan for how things should be done. I want the impression that things are moving smoothly. Maybe it's not the case. We'll hear what the professionals think about that, but it deserves being addressed, this governance of the media. And why did the media ask us to address these issues of governance? Because it's because the information, I will only talk about information, I don't talk about other elements that the media deal with. There's this idea of public good, and as a public good, we have to be concerned with the quality of the information and the influence of interest groups. So I will conclude here and ask Claude to take over the floor. Thank you, Anne. And so we'll hand over the floor to someone who's known both, or the three sides of the mirror, because he's worked in the past at the government level, where he took care of the media in the Balladur government. Then he directed AFP, the French agency. and he is now director of the strategy of the Arno Group in the media. So Pierre, the situation, is it really new with the intervention of the billionaires in the press, and why did Bernard Arnault decide to invest in this sector? Thank you very much for all these simple questions, and thank you, Anne, for addressing presenting all the topics. So we have a little time, so if we want to make progress, I think there's in a nutshell, there's the first reason why there are some rich people involved in the media and the press. It's because for a long time it was very expensive to have printing facility and a newspaper. When you talk about investing in printing facility, we're talking about millions of francs, tens of millions of euros today. And so only the people who could borrow or could invest were capable. We talk about the press. That's not dematerialized. Before it was a heavy industry. For each purchase of a paper spool, it was very expensive. Production fees, expenditures, a system with workers that were well paid, distribution system with different organizations that cost a lot of money, a value change or non-value change linked to paper that's very costly. So you need to have the capital. Not everybody can do that. And so that explains why, since the 1920s or 1930s in this country, in France, very rich people who had another activity on the side invested in the press and the media. It was Coty, the perfumer, before the Second World War, and a lot of people like that. It's today a phenomenon that is quite extended. In Italy, Fiat still owns newspapers. In the U.S., if you take all along the East Coast, from the Boston Globe belongs to a guy who made a fortune on the internet, and he bought the Red Sox baseball team, and New York teams, comes from journalism, but made a fortune in journalism. It's another phenomenon. There's some people who earned a lot of money in the press. In the case of a certain number of publishers of the regional press in France, you have families of Southwest, for example, La Dépêche, and other titles, and bank groups. And so there's a tradition in the East Coast. Boston Globe, Washington Post belongs to Jeff Bezos, or his wife, I think now, and then West Coast, the LA Times, which was practically bankrupt, that belongs to a billionaire from the tech. So there's this phenomenon. The first answer, heavy industry, need for financing. The second thing I wish to share, because we talk about a sector, an industrial sector, and a sector that has to do with the supply of the ingredients of democracy. You have in totalitarian states, you stop the media, stop the press, and the democracy is hindered. So this addition is of importance, and it justifies that it's supported by the public sector. The press is an industry, but what has to do with the press, with democracy, justifies the interventions of the states. And again, so to make sure that everybody in France, even in very remote areas, can benefit from this information. The second thing I would like to say is that what would have happened if billionaires hadn't invested in the press? Well, you would have very few titles to share. It would be a desert in France. There would be some survivors. There are examples of people who became very profitable, like Mediapart, in the digital platforms. They are millionaires, not billionaires, but millionaires. And it's like a club, people who are passionate, who have passion for a subject, and are they form a community. So that if they hadn't been there, well, last point in my introduction, why do these people who are respectable, people who create a lot of value in the country, wealth, thousands of jobs and things, LVMH pays 2.5 billion euros in income tax, so they pay 15% of their income. So the LVMH pays a lot of money from the taxes. And so we say, okay, I think we earn 4 million in public subsidies, but we pay 2.5 billion in taxes. But if these people hadn't invested, it'd be a desert. And these people invest for two reasons. For on the one hand, for LVMH, I can say that when we have faith in liberal economy, and David knows because he developed and directed the Echo newspaper, Les Echos, when you wanted to have ownership of a newspaper that, in the newspaper, it's written on the first page that it's a liberal newspaper. And they create a hotel next to their head office, because we think that the enterprise is more prosperous when the democracy is prosperous. You contribute to finance democracy, and notably because democracy is good for business. Is that shameful? No, I don't think so, because the first effect is to contribute to finance plurality. And maybe last word, there's something I'd like to react to. We have to be very clear among us. There is no need for internal pluralism in a newspaper. Pluralism in newspaper is external. 6,000 publications in France and 6,000 titles. So the pluralism is the number of publications. There are people who publish different weird magazines, but anyway, the internal pluralism is found in radio channels, on television channels. There's a use of the public domain, which is limited in time, subject to conditions, and but there you need a pluralism in the TV and radio media. But in a newspaper, and some newspapers were blamed, privately owned newspaper. Maybe we may not agree with some papers. We can't say that we don't like your paper because there's no democracy. It's not the case. They have an editorial line set by the owner of the newspaper, and I play that role in our group, and then it's implemented by journalism independently, but they follow a certain guideline. So that's the freedom of creating a newspaper. The freedom is there. More differently, in David Guiraud, you will explain how, because you're one of the representatives of the last independent group, independent from all other financial power, proving that you can still work in the press without having afterthoughts. I don't know what you mean when you talk about afterthoughts. I'll talk about the West France paper, or the West France. Very few people know it. Good news, it's not the desert of the media, the press in Brittany, en Bretagne in France, and it'll be continue that way. West France is a group of 5 daily papers, and the leading one in the world, French-speaking newspaper, with a distribution which is leading, more than 600,000 papers, 96 weekly publications, magazines, radio channels, and a very powerful digital presence with platforms that are in the top 10 of French audiences, knowing that West France is first or second. We're struggling against the Figaro. We have 3 platforms, Actu, 20 Minutes, Actu.fr, and we own 50%. 4,000 people, 2,300 journalists, reporters, 3,000 correspondents. There are more than there are thousands of people who work on the information side. It's a group that has been is a candidate for a TNT frequency for television. So it's a powerful group. It's a profitable group that has never stopped investing for years to modernize, and not only in printing machines, but in the digital sector. Even though, and you know that involves investing massively. So what's specific about this group is that it belongs to a 1901 non-profit organizations for 4 years. And so it's a group that is run by a board of a non-profit in which you have about 60 people who are not shareholders, financially speaking, but who are decide on what we need to do with this media group or this press group. The name of this non-profit or association, well, I think is very meaningful. It's the Association for the Support of the Principle of Humanist Democracy. It's a key basis for us because our reason of being as a press group or media group, because we cover more than just the written press, is to bring the citizens together to make sure that the common good makes progress in the respect of everybody's dignity. That's what's written on our front page. All our logos are underlined by the fact that we belong to a non-profit organization. This association was created 34 years ago by a gentleman that at the time directed this group, François-Régis Soutin. And why he created this association? Because for him, as you said, Pierre, our job, of course, boils down to defending democracy. When you give this a thought, it corresponds to our 10-year vision, strategic vision. We don't only think of what newspapers will be like in 10 years, but the starting point is how we can serve democracy in 10 years. And on that, why he did that at the time, maybe you will remember for those who at the time already bought papers, Monsieur Hersan did his shopping. He took over papers here and there. Hersan, very famous. And this paper belonged, West France, belonged to different families who accepted to hand over this paper in the hands of this association. And so our operating mode is, as explained, we operate in a very modern way, contrary to what you may think, because the rencontres économiques today talk about bringing together. And that's written in our reason of being and talking about being hybrid. And we bring together the two cultures, association and culture. Since we have no capital, financial capital, we have much better than that. We have an ethical capital, very powerful, and we earn money just to be able to continue to live and invest. And everybody knows that in our group. It's the price of independence. So this is how our model works, which, well, works quite well. A bit more complicated to manage, and I know about this. I'm at the head of the board, which is a traditional system. It's very aspiring. It's a group that is continuously developing. 6 years ago, we were dwarfs in the digital sector. Today, we are among the top 10. And I can go back on this later. Our strategy lies on 3 pillars, which strengthen each other, but are very important for us. The basis of everything is independence. That's the first pillar. We have to have a strong reason of being, a very strong basis, a manifesto, and we have that. The second is trust. There's no trust today to fight against the GAFAM. So I'd like to go back on that discussion, because we were in an open war with those people who are hacking the brains of the people and applying the strategy of the I didn't hear, I'm sorry. But trust is also built with an internal functioning. And the third pillar, which is also of equal importance, that can only be deployed if both the first two exist, it's power, being powerful. I talked today with colleagues sitting next to me, or who have shared the same reflection. I think we have to be powerful to be able to survive in this kind of media, in this press. We can't imagine that we will continue to do our job as before, and we're constrained to be powerful. Not powerful to be powerful. No. It's a power that lies on size, on technological investments, on a business model, and that also engages the politicians in the political world. So you have in front of you Facebook, TikTok. It's not by being even a very good French group that will manage to succeed. So in terms of power, you're sitting next to a person that is pretty different. It's the only major French group of media we can qualify as being industrial. It's also a subsidiary, or the main shareholder is also Vincent Bolloré, so you're the man. People very curious and wondering, you know, about the freedom and the democracy there. And why is Vincent Bolloré involved in the media? Why do you invest? Thank you very much. Thank you for facing the heat within the scope of this debate. The Vivendi Group is, when it started its third life phase, the first phase was with Jean-Marie Messier when Général des Eaux became Vivendi in '98, then it ended in 2002, period of 10 years, where the group hesitated between the media, telecommunications. For some reason, in 2014, 10 years ago, we opened up the third chapter with clear vision, the ambition of creating a group, French group, very strongly anchored in Europe, with a global ambition in the sector of media, culture, and entertainment. And with a certain number of activities, different activities, different sizes, different importance, but a vision that we share in all our trades. First of all, the fact that the largest common denominator in our trade is the creative process, and the second thing is that the media sector, in the broad sense of the word, was experiencing a Copernican revolution, structural revolution linked with technology, and the fact and the way it exploded all the economic figures, the habits, and the strategic stakes, and everything was so the direct-to-consumer. That was a new form of operating, and the consumer ways, how the people consume the media. This radically changed, and that in a very short period of time. Just an example, Vivendi was the owner of the Universal Music Group. When I joined the group, I was living in London, in England, and they said, "You're crazy, music is dead." And in fact, we just came out of 15 years where the music sector lost 50% of its value, 85% of its value. And streaming platforms, and industrial actor Daniel A. that created Spotify, created the streaming mode. So by subscription, so you no longer bought CDs, but you bought subscriptions, and this revalued the musical catalog, a service approach on the playlist. I don't want to enter the details, but a very tangible example. For me, it's a model and a story that had an impact on all the written media, television, radio, and video games. And Canal Plus, some of you said that Canal Plus will become Canal Minus. I'm happy to say that Canal Plus is in very good health today, and the contrary happened. Why? Because you have a remarkable distribution platform which is called MyCanal, and MyCanal changed totally the behavior of consumers. And when you look at the rules of the games, which you see what happens in the field of advertising, I'm very happy to have all my friends from Havas, we're a subsidiary of the Vivendi Group. A certain number are here in this room. The advertisement market was totally transformed, revolutionized by this technology.
So now let's come back to the project, which is Vivendi's project, and the reason why a remarkable French entrepreneur invested in the Vivendi project, because he became a shareholder in 2011-2012. He started by creating and investing in a channel which was called Director 8, which was then became became C8, run by Director Ballery, who is then the chairman of Vivendi. Its reason is that it was a sector that was opening up prospects, which were prospects for growth and development, which were very attractive. Secondly, when you're an industrialist and you have a capacity to invest, it's great to be able to participate in the industrial innovation because you're able to be an active player in this transformation. So today, in all the professions we are in, we're also in the written press because in 2021 we acquired Prisma, the first French magazine group in France with Femme Actuelle, Géo, and other very well-known titles in France, as well as Harper's Bazaar. So a real revolution has occurred, and we want to be an active participant in this revolution. And this means a number of things have to be called into question. In 2008, I was in charge of the consultative assemblies of the written press under the presidency of Nicolas Sarkozy. At the time, the turnover was 10 billion. Today, it's 6 billion. I don't accept, like my friends here today, the inevitable decline in this activity. The only thing is that there is less advertising, there are less buyers, and there are new consumers. And we have to position ourselves. One of the values in all of our media brands is audience. If you are able to bring audience and added value to this audience, you can create a project which is an industrial, long-term project which is economically viable. When I see media conflict between profitability and freedom, I think the term media is very generic. We're all part of a public service. The information, this is subsidized by the French taxpayer. In our media, I think there's a difference. There's a capacity to be in media which are economically profitable, is a wonderful dynamic. It makes it possible to have this freedom as well. And I absolutely support Pierre in what he says. It's a responsibility of a press owner to define the editorial line. And then it's up to the teams of journalists to adhere to that. They don't have to. And when you have a change of ownership in France, we have something called the transfer clause, so that any journalist who doesn't agree with the potential change in editorial line to leave in very specific beneficial conditions. I don't think any conflict really between this aspect of freedom and the aspect of profitability. Thank you.
In English with Mira. Je sais pas si je dois parler anglais moi d'ailleurs.
I'm not sure I should be speaking English.
Juste un peu.
Yeah.
A little bit, yes.
Speak to us about the system in the other countries. So how do they do when they don't have billionaires to help the newspaper? Is the freedom better or not?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here, and of course, apologies for speaking in English. I will speak a bit about European countries and France as well. I come from a network of more than 200 organizations that support journalists and media and produce journalism in more than 60 countries around the world. And those are mostly small community, investigative, accountability journalism news organizations that are probably very different from some of the models that we have just mentioned here today. And I think the question is, of course, that is there a balance between investing and looking for profit and performing a role for democracy that the press, as the fourth estate, of course, needs to perform. And how do we actually measure that? And how do we see, which kind of journalism really contributes to prosperity of societies, to people being informed? So some of our members actually produce some of the best journalism today. And I'll mention, for instance, Sigma Awards. I suppose that many of you haven't heard of them. Those are international awards for data and investigative journalism. And in 2024, you can look at the short list. One of the examples is the story Narco-Files, New Criminal Order. For this story to be produced, there were 40 newsrooms in 23 countries that had to cooperate to produce this kind of an investigation that looked into organized crime and mechanisms behind how it functions. And this is the DNA of the network where we come from. In today's environment, for these small newsrooms to exist and to serve their communities, they need to work together. So one of the questions here, and especially in Europe, is how do these markets that are much richer than what we call the global majority or global south, how are they performing? And there is a research by the European Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom at the European University Institute in Florence that does yearly media pluralism research, and especially for EU countries. And when they say pluralism, it's not only about the number of outlets, it's looking at ownership concentration. It's looking at impact of owners and commercial interest on the editorial independence. And interestingly enough, if you look at European Union, at the moment, there is no single country in European Union that has a low risk for plurality when it comes to media and market plurality. What does it mean? That most of the countries that we perceive as most developed and free media markets actually are at the scale of medium risk. And in example of France, it's trending towards high risk when it comes to market pluralism. And this is something that we really, all of us, need to pay attention to and make sure that, of course, it's important to invest in media field, and we want to have more investment and, you know, people who have money to produce good journalism and good quality content, but how is that actually providing variety of options for everyone? And then, of course, the example of France at the moment is really interesting because for those looking outside for examples of how do you actually ensure these media pluralism, there is this new decision from the French Council of State that is requiring ARCOM to better enforce its plurality requirements. And this is not only for say news, but also to review all the principles and methods of control exercises towards all the broadcasters. So that will be an interesting process to follow from both European but also international perspective.
From your point of view, what is the best country in Europe for the freedom, for both the freedom of information and maybe the rentability of media? Is there someone who can do both?
I think we have a combination of different market conditions and different traditions, especially in terms of subsidies for media, and also different traditions in terms of how did the industry respond to new media and big tech companies. So, of course, the Nordic countries always perform the best on the freedom of the press rankings and indices. However, they also have very developed and long-term system of subsidies. So one of the things that my network is working on is looking at those different policies and actually looking at the comprehensive industrial policy for journalism in today's day and age. And what does it mean? And how the subsidies need to work and how they can substitute the advertising revenue that was lost, and we'll talk about it later, that was lost by big digital companies capturing it, and not only capturing it, but squeezing a lot of good and quality journalism out of that equation.
Merci, thank you for this information. Donc, dans le contexte actuel.
So, if we look at the current French context, the question of freedom of information has become more complicated over the last few weeks. Julia, what I'm interested in for you, who have to pay the bills at the end of the month. What does this mean when you talk about the freedom of journalism or freedom of information, a little bit of a broader concept, the freedom of journalists? Just a couple of words, because we've talked about this earlier between us. The title of the conference is rather strange. Arnaud has mentioned this already, talking about there's no real conflict, I don't think, between freedom and profitability. This is a false opposition for me. West France is the embodiment of a free and profitable press group. The same thing at Vivendi. There's no opposition between the two. Yes, there is. Yes, there is. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Over the last few weeks, we've seen struggles in the world of media, with journalists refusing to accept the changes of ownership in the media. Okay, this is another subject. We will see, and we will see in the future, these kinds of conflicts. But this is why we have to explain the rights and the duties of each party. I am a great defender of freedom of journalists to work, the independence of each journalist, guaranteed by international conventions, which is a kind of professional ethics system. It has to be part of the work of any journalist to have this freedom, and this has to be protected. When it's not protected, this is not good, and this causes problems in democracies, in countries that are less democratic as well. Apart from independence of a journalist, doesn't mean independence of the editorial line. That's where there's a kind of syllogism. There's a kind of switching over. We'd like to have the different associations of independencies leads to an independent editorial line. That doesn't work. I've a few editorial lines in my team, which is a LVMH media group. You're not completely independent. You're not allowed to independently determine the line. This is fixed by the tradition of the newspaper, of the Les Echos newspaper, which is against extremes, which is secular, and this is the line that we defend. I'd like to say that in the current era, we're very happy to follow that line. We have 150,000 copies more sold at the moment than normally, because people are looking for explanations between these extremes, and Le Parisien newspaper is doing a good job. And the editorial team are doing this very well. Sometimes they would like to talk about this editorial line, but they follow this editorial line. So the independence of each journalist does their own job, but there's no autonomy of the editorial. And the duty of a shareholder is to provide finance. This is an important thing, to provide the money, to transform the media outlets as well. The digital transformation is very important. I often say that for all of the paper chain, we have the costs of production Gutenberg, and we have the competition with Zuckerberg. We have to distribute, we have to transport the newspapers. All of this is very old school, old style, if you like, and opposite that, we have to be just as good online, just as good on our websites and managing our subscribers as people who were born 20 or 25 years ago in the digital world, with a capacity to manage the relations and the relations economy. I'm talking about Facebook and Netflix and all of our other competitors and the other digital players. So we have all of these constraints. We provide finance for innovation and the digital transformation because we believe in a particular model. There's no conflict between freedom and profitability. I think the dynamism of this of the press and the media is proved by the incredible number of different titles. Often when we have these discussions, one of my most fervent defenders is the boss of Humanity, which is a communist newspaper. You could imagine that apart from in the Bolshevik workshops in 1918, things weren't happening like this. You couldn't nominate your own boss. But the boss of Humanity, a communist newspaper, agrees with me. He says the editorial line is communist. I don't want to have an editorial line doing anything else. There's no problem with that. It's never been a generalist title. It's always been on one single line. Yes, it has a communist editorial. I'm surprised that somebody like with the experience, they talk about sport and other things, but it's always followed its editorial line, but it's also limited its development. How do you resolve this problem at West France? I agree. This is a practice we've used for many years. When a journalist joins West France, he or she is given a charter describing the history of the group, the editorial practices that we have, with our reason for being and our reason for existence, our mission. This is very important, and the journalist has to follow this. The problem is when you change the reason for a newspaper existing very suddenly, very quickly. This call into question the reason for the newspaper existing, whether the owner or the journalist. When a journalist is recruited by West France, we explain what the newspaper does. We give them this document. They say, read this, please. And at the end of the day, if you want to join us and if you're interested and if you agree with what we want to do, this is a charter. This charter describes humanist democracy, peace, values like this. If you sign this and you agree, if you don't agree with it, no problem at all. You can go and work somewhere else for another newspaper, for another media outlet. The contract is clear with the journalists. What I believe is that in a lot of newspapers in France, unfortunately, this approach is not clear enough. The reason for the existence of the media outlet is not clear, and so therefore the commitment and the participation of the journalists and the terms of this commitment is not clear. Pierre is right. Independence takes place within a certain framework. After that, nothing is more independent than the editorial team of West France, which talks about thousands of different things, but has a way of doing its job, of giving testimony without being aggressive, of denouncing without condemning. These are very strong values. If a journalist wants to join us and wants to denounce with that and wants to condemn, we don't agree with that. There are 4 values like this. The rules of the game have to be much clearer for everybody, for the shareholders, whoever they are. I forgot to say earlier, but our association is 60 people representing civil society. We have a few journalists and other newspapers as well. And including former Le Monde journalists. We have lawyers, architects, people working in social services. We have a kind of representation of the whole of French society. And we are a major French newspaper. Are things just as clear at Vivendi? There have been a lot of departures when you took over certain media outlets. Do you think an editorial line, does an editorial line have to be followed when you're at Vivendi? Yeah, Claude, you have to be clear. You have to explain why people left. First of all, perhaps you're talking about 10 years ago at a TV channel called Italy, which systematically lost between 20 and 25 million euros per year, and which wasn't sustainable. And so then there was a need to change the TV channel, and this created a disagreement, which was publicized. I'm very happy that after this disagreement had been settled, today we have a channel called C News, which is the leading continuous news channel in France, whereas a few years ago we were being told there was no future for this channel. Secondly, you might be referring to when we took over Prisma. As I was saying earlier, there is a transfer clause which enables any journalist to leave if they want to do something else, or if they don't agree with what might be happening in the group. It's true that the Prisma group was created by a remarkable man who was a competitor called Axel Gans. This group was set up by many different launches. The average age of the journalists was 30 to 40 years old. When there's a change of shareholder, if you look at the age curve of the journalists, this age curve meant that this created conditions which meant that a lot of journalists left. What I want to say is 2 things. I just want to finish. I absolutely agree with what Pierre said about the relationship between autonomy and independence and the editorial line. The second thing, there are 1,200 journalists in the Vivendi group who are all very independent. They all are very talented. You know some of them. And these talented people who I have great respect for, my job is to create the conditions with the Vivendi teams for them to be able to do their job in the best possible conditions. They are with us because they are able to do their job with complete freedom, and I would like to thank them for that, and that's part of my job. What they explained to us, and which is very interesting, is that for Pierre Louet, you said that the group is officially a liberal group. At West France, you sign a charter with the rights and duties. At Vivendi, is there also a similar mechanism like this, so that people have a clear idea of what they are there to do? The ideas are very clear. We are building a group which is a media group. We want it to be sustainable in the long term. We want to create the conditions to be able to process information in any format, whether it's written, radio, TV, or digital. And is there a specific commitment linked to the Vivendi strategy? It so happens that we have on many occasions, whether it's with the National Assembly or the Senate, or during other hearings, we confirmed this was not the case. And as you are referring to the reference shareholder of the group, this shareholder has recently pointed this out. Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of our debate. I would like to ask you, for each one of you, what are the worst dangers that are threatening information? This morning I was at a debate which was about the dangers that are threatening democracy at the moment, in particular the digital giants, and the fact that the media are considered to be the best rampart against fake news. Do you today have in mind, in fact, that you are running, or you are leading and you're defending democracy, and how do you do that today? How can we still today take action to do that without contributing to the existing disorder? We could talk about this for many hours. The first point is that to create the conditions make it possible to give high quality information. The second point is we create the economic conditions to withstand these digital giants, despite the attrition and the huge economic resources they have. The third point is that in France we tend to create an opposition between big and small. The big and the small have to be together to defend both of their interests. And the last point is that, concerning the last point about the debate about democracy, I think when you have a problem, to solve it, you have to be able to name it. Our job in the media is to name the problems, and then you have to have a debate, and that's a very virtuous thing to do to defend democracy in itself.
I would like to take a bit of a kind of a step back and a global view where we are in the markets at the moment. So over the last 20 years, in terms of profitability, especially in the digital field, there has been an equal distribution of who are the winners of the digital, especially programmatic advertising field. And I can go into details for hours, but in general, I think that news companies could have acted 10 years ago to impact the way that bargaining and bidding in the programmatic advertising field was done, so that actually incentivizes and motivates publishers to produce better quality news, because at the moment the advertising goes to the lowest common denominator and the cheapest property online. So that's one thing that has happened and it still hasn't been resolved. And unfortunately, the income for publishers has grown at the rate of 1%, whereas the income for the digital global companies and the advertising revenues for programmatic has grown at 10% per year. So we have the new challenge now, where if we don't join forces, there will be even less space for quality journalism and media to earn money and produce profits. It's of course called artificial intelligence, but not only at the level of so-called services as software, when content is being produced by LLMs, but at the layer of infrastructure. Infrastructure is becoming in cloud expensive, but it's needed for everyone to be able to produce journalism. Only by acting together, especially in Europe, we will have an opportunity to have democratic cloud that will allow this contrast between liberty and freedom and good content and profitability to be managed to everyone's benefit.
Il nous reste très peu de temps, donc.
We don't have much time. Perhaps Pierre and Eric and Arnaud, could you tell us in a few words how we can fight against this difficult world and this different context we're in at the moment? Quite honestly, I'm quite worried because the war is taking place in people's brains. We have to be aware that what was originally a horizontal utopia with sharing thanks to internet has now become something that is vertical. Vertical monopolies run by 2 or 3 people on the right or the left in the US and in China. And we have changed, as Asmala has said, we've changed from the economy of knowledge to cognitive capitalism. With AI that is arriving now, the danger is that we're going to be submerged. So, faced with this, as I was saying earlier, we have one thing we have is our brands, and our readers trust our brands, thanks to the quality of our work and the independence of journalists, etc. But we have to invest a lot of money to be able to fight against these other forces. We can't do it alone. We have to do it together. We have to do it together on a European level with the politicians and the right policies. Otherwise, in a few years' time, I think, unfortunately, it will be much too late. I think I couldn't have said anything better. David and Arnaud have said everything that needs to be said. I hope everybody's not too depressed. I think what we have to say, we're very determined. We have more and more readers. That's something that's very hopeful as well in the digital world. The readership has been increasing for 14 years, and the number of readers online is also increasing. We want to be suppliers of the ingredients for democracy. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything. Perhaps questions from the audience? No? No questions? We don't have time. Okay. Thank you very much.